Chapter 1. Brodie Callahan pushed his hat back and wiped sweat about his eyes with a thickly muscled, tanned forearm. The sun beat down on his shoulders, and he almost felt roasted through the thin, faded cotton of his button-down shirt. Because of the unusually dry South Dakota summer, though, the cattle at the Circle G needed some supplemental feed. The grazing these days was hit and miss, with the fields full of hard-baked dirt and scraggly, burnt grass. He couldn't wait to get back to the bunkhouse, where the ranch cook, Mrs. Hollis, would have some ice-cold lemonade waiting. Swinging another bale of straw from the bed of the pickup truck, he wondered what early October was like in eastern Tennessee. As he bumped the truck over the rutted gravel and dirt drive of the truck lot, he saw a black BMW station wagon parked by the main house. Ryder and Willa must be back from their trip to town. He knew that they'd taken their little one, Raven, in for her 1-month checkup. He also knew that their fridge was probably stocked with a pitcher of Mrs. Hollis's lemonade and that Raven was a lot cuter and more fun to hang out with than the ranch hands. Changing directions, he pulled the truck up behind their car. He knocked at the back door. Willa hollered at him to come in, and he did, wiping his dusty boots on the mat first. Mrs. Hollis did the housekeeping at the main house, too, and he liked to stay on her good side. He swore she had the boot sizes of every male on the property memorized. She never failed to know exactly who tracked mud in on her clean floors. Ryder and Willa were in the living room, along with a wailing infant with a shock of dark hair, tucked into a car seat that was perched on the coffee table. "I'll take her," he said happily, heading back to the kitchen to wash up first. Seconds after the warm, fragrant bundle of baby was set in his arms, she stopped crying, blinking up at him with the bluish-colored eyes so common to newborns. "How you doing, sweet pea?" he crooned. "Uncle Brodie," Willa sighed, falling back on the couch and pushing her long black hair out of her eyes, "will you come live with us and be our nanny?" He can't help it if he's a horse whisperer and a baby whisperer. Ryder laughed. His friend was smiling, but Brodie could tell he was exhausted from the sleepless nights the couple had been experiencing. He didn't want to have to break the news to them, especially now, but it had to be done. He looked down at tiny Raven, half hoping she'd start bawling again and give him an excuse to put off the conversation. She was no help. She'd fallen asleep, her little rosebud mouth puckered and long lashes sweeping over her cheeks. He felt a tug in his heart. Before he could speak, he saw Willa eyeing him. "You've got it, don't you?" "Got what?" he asked, bewildered. "Baby fever." Brodie shook his head automatically, looking toward Ryder. "No way," he laughed. "I'm just good with ladies of all ages." "Good for putting them to sleep?" Ryder grinned. "Come on, just admit it. You're scared of the idea of putting yourself on the marriage market. You want Dr. Lachele's number, don't you?" "I have no trouble meeting women, thank you very much." Brodie narrowed his eyes and cocked his head to the side. "Besides, are you guys trying to marry me off? You looking for another foreman? Trying to get rid of me? And isn't Dr. Lachele that little lady in purple that hooked you two up at the altar? You know very well who Dr. Lachele is. You met her when she came here for my interview. Remember? She called you one of the cutest cowboys she'd ever seen." Willa, his boss and friend for the last 16 years, shook her head sadly and smiled at him. "You know you want to settle down, Brodie. You're a little past 30 now, aren't you?" "Not getting any younger," she teased. "We knew we wouldn't be able to keep you here with us forever." "Yeah," he admitted, nuzzling Raven's sweet-smelling hair. "It's time to move on. I'd like to get my own little place. Raise some horses. Maybe raise some babies, too." "Well," Ryder said, "I suppose if you want those babies, you're going to have to find a wife first. You'll need this." He pulled a dog-eared business card from his wallet and handed it to Brodie. Across the front of the card, Matchrimony was scrolled in elegant purple letters. Still cradling the baby in one arm, he looked at the card and took a deep breath. He was nervous, but felt a jolt of excitement at the thought of finally finding the perfect mate. He had no doubt in the matchmaker's abilities, he only had to look at Willa and Ryder to see that she knew her business. "I guess I have a phone call to make, then." He carefully handed Raven over to Ryder, who winced and took the small bundle as gingerly as if Brodie had handed him a suitcase full of dynamite. 2 seconds later, Raven was awake and screaming her displeasure to the world. "Reconsider the nanny thing, won't you?" Willa groaned as Brodie shrugged apologetically and headed for the back door, already pulling his cell phone out of his pocket before he could give himself time to reconsider. He headed for the barn and up the stairs to his foreman's office in the loft. This was a phone call he didn't want overheard by the other guys. They'd tease him mercilessly. With the door shut firmly and a cold can of Coke from the mini fridge in front of him, he dialed the New York phone number with a finger that shook only slightly. 2 rings later, a cheerful voice sang out, "You've reached Matchrimony, Dr. Lachele speaking. How can I help you?" Brodie cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I'm not sure if you'll remember me, but I'm Brodie Callahan, the foreman at the Circle G Ranch." Willa and Ryder. Dr. Lachele cut him off with a silvery-sounding giggle. "Oh, Brodie, of course I remember you. You're the tall, handsome cowboy with a little bit of a Paul Newman look about you, especially with those blue eyes." How could I forget? Brodie had flirted with his fair share of women, but he felt himself blushing. Before he could think of a response to her outrageous comments, though, she continued. "Are you going to be my newest client? Please tell me yes, so I can come out there and visit my newest matrimony munchkin while I interview you." Munchkin? Oh, you must mean Willa's daughter, Raven. I haven't asked, but I'm sure Willa wouldn't mind having you stay in the main house for a couple of days. Raven's a bit of a handful, and I'm sure she and Ryder would probably appreciate the distraction. I should ask her first, though. Don't you worry about that, Dr. Lachele said. I'll call her right now and tell her that I'll be there for a booby bump as soon as I can book a flight. See you soon. Brodie was left staring at the phone in his hand, wondering what in the world a booby bump was. Emily Murphy danced into the lobby of her apartment building, high-fiving the elderly doorman on her way. "Good morning, Ms. Murphy," he laughed. "What's got you so chipper today?" Emily pushed back her curly red hair and grinned back at the doorman. "William, today is the best day of my life. I thought last Tuesday was the best day of your life, when you got that new job as a yoga instructor. Or was it the Friday before, when you thought you met Oprah on the subway?" He scratched his grizzled chin thoughtfully, his eyes twinkling. She waved off his teasing good-naturedly. "No way, nothing tops this," Emily shot back, bouncing on her toes in excitement. "A friend of mine that has a catering business got me a waitressing gig for one of the swankiest parties in New York." She lowered her voice and raised her eyebrows dramatically, her green eyes gleaming. "You'll never guess who's throwing it." "Taylor Swift." William squinted. "Taylor who?" "Never heard of him." "She's a singer. Huge celebrity. I'm going to meet her, probably, and be rubbing elbows with all kinds of famous people. Plus, I'm going to make more in one night than I would in a month of teaching yoga. Maybe I'll even get a chance to talk to her and convince her that my boss's yoga studio is the place to be, and next thing you know, all the uber-famous people will be lining up outside to get in. You sure do get some big ideas, Ms. Emily." William chuckled. "Play your cards right, William." She winked. "And I might just bring you rich people leftovers from the buffet." Emily spun around and continued to boogie across the shabby lobby, toward the elevator. "Wait." William called after her. "I almost forgot to tell you, a certified letter came for you. Probably a bill collector." She shrugged, darting back to take the envelope. "They sure are persistent. See you later." She hit the button for the rickety old elevator and tapped her foot, singing one of Taylor Swift's songs in a clear, sweet soprano that surprised William. He'd never heard her sing before. He shook his head and smiled. Having Emily Murphy around sure did brighten his days, and it seemed like nothing could dim the shine that she carried with her. Emily glanced at the label on the overnight envelope in the elevator, wincing. Folsom, Pickett, and Clive. Sounded like either a 70s band or a law firm. She stepped out into the hallway, trying to remember the last time she'd paid her credit card bill. She'd just been so busy lately. Unlocking her door, she cautiously hit the light switch. The overhead bulb came on, lighting the entryway, and she let out a relieved breath. She must have remembered to pay her electric bill, anyway, and thank God for small miracles. Tossing her keys into the empty fruit bowl on her tiny kitchen table, she pulled back the tab that sealed the envelope. Pulling out a single sheet of paper, she read, "Dear Ms. Murphy, we regret to inform you." Suddenly, Emily's knees were too weak to hold her up and she sank into a chair at the table. Taylor Swift and credit card bills were immediately forgotten. Her sister, Faith, who had run away from their foster home when she was 16 and Emily was only 14, had died. Emily hadn't seen or heard from her in all the years since, but Faith had left her something. A 10-year-old son named Alec. Brodie hadn't been given any time to regret or even reflect over his decision to call Matchrimony. The following 2 days, he'd started putting the word out in the Deadwood area that the Circle G was looking for a new foreman, and he and Ryder had already interviewed 3 people for the job. The third candidate, a woman named Lachele, ended up being perfect for the position, and pending a background check and some follow-up on references, it looked like Brodie had already found a replacement. Then, true to her word, Dr. Lachele arrived only a day after that. Brodie offered to drive to the airport and pick her up, but he was vetoed by Willa, who insisted on meeting Lachele herself. Privately, Brodie figured she just wanted a quiet 2 hours in the car with no screaming baby, so, feeling sorry for Ryder, he spent the afternoon holding the peaceful, sleeping infant, while Ryder Googled properties with barns and acreage in eastern Tennessee. "Why Tennessee?" Ryder asked curiously, looking up from his laptop screen. "That's horse country, my friend," Brodie responded. "Some of the best horses in the world are bred in that region. Plus, there are mountains. It's pretty there." "Well, how about this one?" Ryder asked. "Beautiful historic home on 50 acres near Wolf Creek, Tennessee. Mountain views and well-kept barns and outbuildings. Private setting only a few miles from grocery stores, restaurants, and nightlife. Sounds nice. How much?" "Rock bottom price of $200,000. How much do you have in your piggy bank?" "Well, I live pretty cheaply, and I've been saving for the last decade. I'm not rich, but I could swing something like that." "Let me see the picture." Brodie leaned over, and Ryder turned the computer screen toward him. Brodie whistled softly. "Now that's a pretty place." The house itself looked like something out of an old photograph, beautiful and stately in brick. Even though the picture was a little grainy, he could make out turrets and gables and big bay windows, and though the grounds were overgrown, he saw blossoming fruit trees. But the house wasn't as important as the barns. Thankfully, those pictures were a bit clearer, and he grew more and more convinced that this was his dream property the further Ryder scrolled through the pictures. Picturesque views, neat, white-fenced fields, mountain streams winding through tumbled boulders the size of small cars. The 3 small barns looked old but clean, sturdy, and freshly painted. "I want it. Maybe you could fly out," Ryder began, but Brodie was already shaking his head. "Nope. That place is mine." Ryder looked like he was about to argue, but they heard the front door open. "Bring me my munchkin baby," a sweet voice demanded. Raven's eyes flew open wide at the sudden noise, and she screwed up her little face to cry, but in the next moment, she was being scooped up by a woman with a sweet pixie-like face and a vivid purple dress that echoed the color of her hair. Instead, the baby just looked amazed. As the adults watched, Raven's pudgy cheeks dimpled, her eyes scrunched up, and she gifted the matchmaker with her very first smile. Dr. Lachele just nodded in satisfaction. "That's my precious girl," she cooed. "Now," she said, turning her attention to Brodie. "We'll let the new parents go have a night out, and you and I will get down to brass tacks." 15 minutes later, Willa and Ryder were pushed briskly out the front door with instructions to go watch a movie and get some pizza, and Lachele, Brodie, and Raven were comfortably settled into the living room with glasses of lemonade and a bottle of formula, respectively. "Mr. Handsome Cowboy." Dr. Lachele grinned. "I'm going to need you to tell me all about yourself." Emily was at her wit's end, pacing a rut in front of the big windows at the airport that looked out over the tarmac. It had been 3 days since she had discovered that she was not only an aunt, but also going to be a surrogate mother, and her usual optimism and cheerful attitude seemed to have deserted her. Any second now, a tiny human being would walk into the terminal, and she, Emily Murphy, a 26-year-old yoga instructor/dancer/singer/receptionist/dog walker, a woman who couldn't even keep track of her bills or remember to eat a salad once in a while, would be responsible for raising him. She'd called friends for advice, but none of them had kids, and none of them seemed interested in hanging out and helping to sort through the problems of someone who suddenly did. Her first thought as Alec came into view was that her 10-year-old nephew wasn't a tiny human being. His shoulders were slumped as he shuffled along, looking at his shoes, but he still had to be a few inches taller than Emily's own 5'3". She knew he was her nephew immediately. Her throat squeezed as she recognized the exact same shade of her sister's reddish-brown hair on this thin, awkward-looking boy. He looked up, hesitantly, and tears came to her eyes. Alec had the same fair skin and gray eyes as Faith. Emily held up the poster board she'd scrawled his name on a little bit higher to get his attention, and without changing expression, he headed her way. Emily was a natural hugger, but Alec was not. She squeezed him tight, trying to sniffle back tears, but he held himself stiffly, and she let him go, so he wouldn't be uncomfortable. "Hey, kiddo," she said softly, looking him over. "I'm your aunt. You can call me Emily, or Em if you want." He didn't look up or say anything, just shuffled those big feet of his in their scuffed tennis shoes. Emily felt dizzy for a second. When he grew out of those shoes, probably sometime in the next 5 minutes, she was going to need to buy him more. That's what moms did. "You want to go grab some lunch? How long is the flight from Florida anyway?" He still didn't answer, but she hooked her arm through his skinny one and tugged him along beside her, chattering determinedly. "Have you been to a big city before? New York is one of the most exciting cities ever. So many tall buildings, people everywhere." She darted a glance at her nephew, to see if he was impressed, but he looked more scared than anything. His gray eyes were wide and fearful as he tried to take it all in, and a smattering of freckles across his nose stood out on his pale face. "Let's splurge on a taxi." Emily sighed. "It's a little too soon to introduce you to the joys of the New York subway system, I think." By the time she'd shepherded Alec through a burger and fries at McDonald's, only managing to coax a few mumbled words out of him, and herded him home, where he promptly fell asleep on her sofa at only 6 o'clock in the evening, Emily was near tears. She had no idea what to do with this silent, grieving little boy. Until last week, Emily's life was carefree and fun, full of parties, adventures, friends, and flitting from one interesting thing to another. Now, she was responsible for someone else's life, and Emily couldn't begin to think about what the loss of her sister meant to her. Her feelings didn't matter right now. Studying Alec, looking calm and peaceful in sleep and far more relaxed than he did when he was awake, Emily knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed help. She needed a partner. Then a light dawned. She needed a husband. Like, now. Chapter 2. "Well, Layla, I don't even think you need me here." He grinned at the older woman, who had just been hired as the newest foreman, or was that forewoman, of the Circle G. Layla smiled back and nodded, politely refraining from pointing out that she had organized Brodie's office her first morning on the job and she probably knew the ranching business better than he did. "I think I've got it covered for now," she said soberly, but her eyes twinkled. "Just in case you want to run up to the main house and cuddle that baby some more." Brodie was reluctant to leave, but he knew it wasn't his office anymore, really. He nodded, though, and asked Layla to call him if she needed anything. They both knew she wouldn't. He didn't have time to brood over it, though, because his phone buzzed as soon as he reached the bottom of the steps. It was a text from Dr. Lachele, telling him to head for the house ASAP. Puzzled, he broke into a jog. He couldn't imagine what else she wanted to talk about. The woman had grilled him for 6 hours the day before, for Pete's sake. Then his heart stuttered for a second. Maybe she had already found him a match. He picked up the pace until he was practically running. Lachele was waiting for him on the back steps, but she had a thoughtful look on her face. "What's going on?" he asked, a little winded. "Well, I just had an interesting phone call." Lachele suddenly focused on him, and she laughed. You didn't waste any time getting here, did you? He smiled ruefully and wiped sweat off his brow with the back of his arm. My mama taught me that when a lady says pronto, she means it. He followed her into the kitchen. Willa was seated at the table, hungrily devouring what looked like a turkey sandwich, and she quickly held a finger to her lips. Baby's sleeping, she hissed. Don't make a sound. Brodie glanced around, even checking under the table. Where, he mouthed. When Willa pointed to the other side of the sprawling house, where the bedrooms were located in a separate wing, he had to stifle a chuckle. There was no way Raven would hear them in the kitchen. But he nodded. Maybe we should take our conversation back outside, he whispered to Dr. Lachele. She nodded back, a grin tugging at the corner of her lips, and they both quietly backed out of the kitchen. Brodie pulled the mudroom door shut. How about the picnic table, he asked. It's still hotter than heck out, but at least it'll be shady. Brodie, do you believe in coincidences? Lachele asked seriously as soon as they were seated. Well. Brodie squinted and looked off toward the fields. Not really. I believe that everything's part of a plan. God's plan. He flushed a little, not used to speaking his beliefs out loud, but when he glanced up at Lachele, she was beaming. I'm so glad to hear you say that. Now, normally, I have a process to my matchmaking. I meet the prospective bride or groom, interview them. Interrogate them, you mean? Brodie laughed, and she swatted at him. Interview them, and then match them with the person that fits them best according to a very detailed set of criteria. But, ultimately, whether things work out or not isn't up to me. Like I was saying, I got an interesting phone call earlier. It was from a prospective bride, and normally I don't share any information at all, but this case is a little bit different. There's a child involved. A 10-year-old boy. And? Brodie leaned forward, all ears. He loved kids, too, not just babies. And that's it. Dr. Lachele leaned back and folded her arms, studying him searchingly. That's all I can tell you. I can't give you any details about the situation because that's breaking the rules. I've already told you more than I normally tell my candidates. My assistant interviewed this person at length and sent me a full report, and while I'd like to meet her in person before I make the final decision, I think at first sight, this would be a good match for you and maybe one of those not coincidence things we were just talking about. But you needed to know that there is a half-grown munchkin to consider. Moving across the country into a house he'd bought last night in an online transaction, sight unseen, starting a business, marrying a woman he'd never laid eyes on. That was all crazy enough, Brodie thought, but to throw a child into the bargain and have a ready-made family? I don't believe in coincidences, Brodie finally repeated, blowing out a breath and taking a leap of faith. You do your thing, Dr. Lachele, and, he nodded upward, toward the blue South Dakota sky that showed in patches through the leafy branches of the old oak above them. He'll do his. When Emily leaned across the counter in the small retiring room to fix a loose curl, the beaded bodice of the wedding dress she had bought the day before bit into her waist. Maybe it'll strangle the butterflies, she muttered, tucking the bright red strand of hair back into the complicated twist she wore. Did you say something? A cheery voice asked. Emily spun around, just in time to be hugged by Dr. Lachele, the petite, purple-haired matchmaker. She instantly felt the tears that had been bubbling beneath the surface well up, but Lachele shook her finger. No crying, she admonished briskly. This is the happiest day of your life. Are you sure? Emily asked, wishing her question had come out jokingly instead of so plaintive-sounding. She wished she had a mom or a sister. Don't go there, Emily, or anyone, really, to ask for advice. Was she doing the right thing for Alec by marrying a stranger? He certainly hadn't reacted when she told him she was getting married. Dr. Lachele's face was kind, as if she understood what Emily was thinking, and she gave Emily another quick hug. It'll be all right, Lachele murmured, patting her on the shoulder comfortingly. You're marrying a very good man, I promise. Now do you want to meet my husband? He's also a very good man, and he's excellent at walking brides down the aisle. I've let him practice several times on my clients. Emily nodded gratefully. Just a few quick touches. Lachele briskly tugged Emily's veil into place and tweaked the white satin skirt so it fell just so. Gorgeous. Where in the world did you get this on such short notice? It fits you like a dream. Emily chuckled, feeling her optimism slowly returning. A thrift store, she stated proudly. Not a stain on it, accessories included, and it fit almost perfectly. Not bad for $30, and I managed to find it in the first store I went to. Can you believe the coincidence? That seemed to tickle the matchmaker, because she burst into laughter. There's no such thing as a coincidence, honey, Dr. Lachele finally said when she could catch her breath. Now tug that veil down, and let's go get you married. But as they stepped out of the retiring room, there was a familiar face in the foyer of the small church that Matchrimony had booked for her wedding. William, the doorman from her building, stood awkwardly in a dusty-looking black suit. His weathered face creased in a smile. Look at you, Ms. Emily, you're pretty as a picture. I hope you don't mind me just showing up like this, but you had mentioned once that your parents had passed on a long time ago, and I thought you might need someone to give you away. Tears threatened again, but Emily managed to hold them back. I'd be honored, William, she said instead with a brilliant smile and took his arm. Brodie shuffled his feet nervously. He was at the altar, and in record quick time, too, but he wasn't fully convinced he shouldn't run away. He felt like he was under a hot spotlight and ran a finger around the collar of his suit. The only people in the church were Lachele's husband, a tall, friendly-looking guy, and a boy that must be his bride's son. He hadn't been able to make eye contact with him yet. The third and last person was a kind-looking minister, who was throwing glances Brodie's way as if he could sense Brodie's thoughts of skedaddling. Lachele wasn't present. She had gone to fetch his bride. His bride. What if they didn't get along? What if she didn't like him? And he hated to be shallow, but what if they weren't attracted to each other? What if? Every thought left Brodie's head when the doors at the other end of the aisle opened. A vision stood there, dressed in a long antique-looking white gown with silvery color beading that glittered different colors when the sunlight from the stained glass window behind the nave caught it. Her face was hidden by the gauzy fall of a veil, but she was short, curved beautifully in all the right places, and her hair. A brilliant, pure shade of red. He caught a glimpse of a stray curl and immediately, his fingers itched to see if it was as soft as it looked. He barely noticed the elderly black man on one side of her, who was giving her away. He paid hardly any attention to Lachele, on her other side, a sunny, proud smile lighting her face. His eyes were only on his bride, now walking slowly, but with a bounce in her step, down the aisle. Emily was having a similar reaction. The nervousness she felt immediately disappeared at the sight of the tall blonde man who stood at the altar, impeccably dressed in a black suit and white shirt that fit snugly over his broad shoulders. She tried to keep her pace slow, but she wanted to get closer to see if this man's eyes were really as blue as they appeared through the light shimmer of her veil. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, William led her up the few short steps and deposited her across from her groom with a warm hug. As if he couldn't wait any longer to see her face, Emily's almost husband leaned over and gently lifted her veil. He let out an almost soundless breath, and she felt her fair cheeks turn pink while he studied her face, unsmiling, like he was trying to memorize it. His eyes truly were an electric blue, set off by a tan that spoke of a life lived outdoors. His hair was just a bit long, and the sun-streaked strands fell casually over his forehead. Then, her heart nearly stopped when his lips spread into an appreciative grin. "Hello," he whispered, his voice deep and resonant. "Hi," she whispered back, incredibly glad that her voice didn't squeak. Nearby, the minister cleared his throat. "Shall we begin?" he asked, also in a whisper. Emily blushed even pinker and nodded. The ceremony took nearly no time at all, and before he knew it, Brodie was speaking the words that would make his bride, Emily, his to have, hold, and cherish. With the speaking of their vows, Emily Murphy became Emily Callahan, and Brodie became a husband. And a father. He glanced toward the boy in the front pew, who looked back at him with a distant expression, but not an unfriendly one. Mindful of his young audience, Brodie kissed his new bride almost chastely, brushing his lips lightly over hers in a brief caress. She tasted like strawberries, and the look in her wide green eyes told him that she was just as affected as he was by their first kiss. Emily smiled and said thank you at all the right times to her well-wishers, and made introductions and gave hugs where they were needed or offered, but all she could focus on was the warm imprint of her new husband's hand on her lower back. Brodie Callahan. He looked and sounded just like a movie star, playing a cowboy. He even had the perfect cowboy name. She couldn't wait to ask him all about himself and find out where they would live. Her sense of adventure was tingling, and she wanted to fling her veil in the air, grab Alec and Brodie, and run off into the sunset to begin their happy new family life. But first, they had a wedding luncheon to attend. Even though Matchrimony provided a limo ride to the nearby restaurant and Emily had never ridden in one, she barely registered the smooth leather beneath her or the tiny red rosebuds tucked into vases attached to consoles. William had actually managed to get Alec to talk, and the two had their heads bent together, figuring out how the flat-screen TV worked. Dr. Lachele and her husband were chatting with the minister, and that left Emily and Brodie together. Brodie cast around for some kind of conversation starter, but his tongue was tied in knots. Emily was in a league above and beyond any woman he'd ever dated before back in South Dakota. She was beautiful, yes, but she also had that sheen of polish that some big city women seem to have. What if she thought he was a dumb country bumpkin? Emily wondered why Brodie was being so quiet. He didn't seem unhappy, just quiet. Tall, blonde, and silent type? That was fine, she'd often been told she talked enough for two. So, Mr. Callahan, she said cheerfully. Have you always known you'd marry someone you'd never met? He chuckled, the sound warm and deep, and she wanted to shiver. No, Mrs. Callahan, I sure didn't. What made you decide to use Matchrimony? Some friends of mine, Brodie replied. Well, their baby girl, actually. They've been married just over a year, and Dr. Lachele set them up at the altar, too, and it worked out so well, I was hoping she could do the same for me. I'd like a family. He hesitated a little. A big family, actually. You? I can see you've already got a start. Oh, I've always wanted lots of kids, Emily assured him. Just not until I was older. I don't mean to sound rude, but how old were you when? Emily lowered her voice. 26. But you don't look old enough to have a 10-year-old son. You're 34? No. I'm 24. I'm not following, Brodie said, a puzzled expression on his face. She lowered her voice even more, and he had to lean over to hear her. I just became a mom less than a week ago. Alec is my nephew, and my sister passed away. He doesn't know me at all. Ah. Brodie's face cleared. I'm so sorry about your sister. That makes a lot more sense. And actually, I feel a little better now. We're both new at this. Emily's face lit eagerly. Did you have a lot of siblings? Honestly, that was my reason for marrying so soon. I have no clue how to take care of a kid, and I wanted a partner. No siblings, Brodie replied, shaking his head ruefully. That's why I always wanted a house full of kids. He took her hand as her face fell in disappointment, his larger calloused fingers tracing a pattern on the back of her much smaller hand. The unfamiliar and tantalizing sensation left her catching her breath and feeling flushed. But I can promise you, I will be your partner, Emily Callahan. We'll handle everything together. Till death do us part. From across the back of the limo, something Alec never in his whole life figured he'd get a chance to ride in, Alec carefully watched his Aunt Emily and her new husband. They were talking in whispers, so he couldn't hear what they were saying, but they both looked really happy. Alec couldn't help it. It made him feel kind of lonely. He really missed his mom, and his aunt seemed nice and said all the right things, but he had tried not to talk to her much. It seemed like everyone he got close to ended up going away. His mom died of cancer. His dad left when he was just a baby. He didn't have any grandparents. His friends from his school in Florida wouldn't get to hear about his cool limo ride and had probably already found another kid to replace him at their lunch table. Alec didn't even want to start to like Aunt Emily and her brand new husband. If he talked too much, they'd probably figure out he was a dork and find someplace else to send him anyway. So, instead, he focused on Mr. William, who was super cool for an old guy and knew almost as much about airplanes as Alec did. Maybe even more, because his father had been one of the original Tuskegee Airmen, one of the elite black fighter pilots that flew combat missions in World War II. And Mr. William had been an airplane mechanic himself before he'd retired and started working as the doorman for Aunt Emily's apartment complex. At least he had Mr. William for a friend. Chapter 3. Emily was usually totally confident in any situation, but spending her wedding night with her new husband in a cramped, messy apartment, with her nephew on the pull-out couch bed in the living room, was not a situation she was prepared for. She wished she'd at least had a chance to clean before she brought Brodie home, but after their luncheon was finished and they'd said goodbye and thanks and received congratulations from everyone, there was nothing left to do but go back to her apartment. She'd been hoping her new husband would sweep her off her feet and carry them to his home, but she didn't even know yet where Brodie lived. He had a duffel bag with him, but no suitcases or worldly belongings strapped to his back. Emily and her new husband had some definite things to figure out, ASAP. "You have a cute apartment," Brodie said honestly, looking around. It was messy and cluttered, sure, and not very big, but compared to his room at the Circle G, there was actually a little more space. Emily had decorated in what he was coming to think of as her personality, lots of warm, bright colors, mismatched throw pillows, quirky figurines, and framed vintage posters. The effect was fun and welcoming. "Thank you. It's a little small for 3 people, though," she answered. "What's the plan for our, living arrangements?" Brodie's face lit up with enthusiasm. "Right. I haven't told you about that. Do you mind if I change out of these wedding duds, and I can show you some pictures?" "Sure. Bathroom's down the hall." "Sorry, but it's not built for a guy your size. I'll change in my bedroom." "No problem," he smiled. "I'll manage." "Alec," Emily asked the boy, who was sitting on the couch with a book William had given him. He had already taken off his suit coat and rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt. "Would you like to get into some jeans and join us at the kitchen table?" He looked up for a moment with a flicker of interest on his face, but then seemed to stifle it, looking back down at his book. "That's okay," he muttered. "I'm reading." "All right. Feel free to listen in and give your feedback. This has to do with you, too." Patience, Emily reminded herself. They all had a lot to get used to, Alec especially. He'd come around when he was ready. Emily changed out of her wedding dress and carefully hung it in the closet. It wasn't actually an heirloom, but it was very pretty, and maybe she'd have a daughter to pass it down to one day. Along with a crazy wedding origin story. She chuckled to herself and slipped into some denim capris and a loose button-down shirt, fussing with her hair a minute in front of her dollhouse-sized vanity table. She wanted to look nice for her new husband, who was so handsome himself that it almost made her shiver to look at him. Mrs. Callahan. She could get used to that. Brodie was already sitting at the table with a laptop, long legs stretched out in a way that made the kitchen look even smaller, and his eyes sparkled in appreciation when she came out of her bedroom. "I hope you don't mind me saying, Emily, but you sure are a pretty-looking woman." She winked. "And you're a rather good-looking man yourself, Brodie." A muffled cough came from behind the book Alec was buried in. "Sorry, kiddo," Brodie laughed. "We'll keep the gushy stuff to a minimum." "Have you lived in New York all your life?" he asked Emily curiously. "No, I grew up in a small town in Maryland, actually. My parents passed away when I was 4, and my sister and I were placed in a foster home." Brodie tactfully pretended not to notice the way his new bride's eyes welled with tears at the mention of her family, and from the corner of his own eye, he could see Alec peeking over the top of the book he held. "Did you live in the country? Or suburbs?" "We were just a little ways out in the country," Emily said. "My foster parents had a small farm, with a couple of chickens and gardens, practically what would now be called a suburban homestead. It was only a 5-minute drive from town." "How do you feel about being out in the country again?" I would miss New York, she admitted, but I think it would be nicer for Alec to grow up the way his mom and I did. Great, I was hoping you would say that. What do you think about this? Brodie turned the computer toward her, with the listing of the house he'd bought the week before. Emily looked at Brodie's face first. He was eager and hopeful, and she told herself that no matter what, she'd like what he showed her. She couldn't make out what she was looking at first, because the picture was so blurry, but realized that it was a very old house. It did have character. Is this yours? She asked with a smile. It's ours. He grinned back. She clicked the next photo. Barns. Do you have animals? Not yet. Keep going. Emily heard Alec shuffle up behind her, but she didn't turn around, in case he didn't want her to realize he was interested. Mountains? Where is this at? Near Wolf Creek, Tennessee, Brodie answered proudly. I just bought this farm. Emily felt a pang at the thought that she'd be leaving New York behind. She had friends here, a job, excitement, and fun. Would she be able to have the same in a completely different state? She'd never even heard of Wolf Creek. Emily kept any trace of hesitation from her face, though, when she looked up at her new husband. I love it. When do we go? We're moving again? Alec burst out. I just got here. Whoa, bud. Brodie stood up and held out a placating hand. I promise, this is going to be great. The boy's sober gray eyes filled, and his face flushed angrily. That's what my mom always said, he burst out. This next town is going to be the best, Alec. You're going to love it here, Alec. But as soon as I got settled in and found friends, boom. We moved. I wasn't even in New York a week, and now I have to leave the only friend I found. He whirled around and darted for the only private room in the apartment. The bathroom door slammed shut, and they heard the snick of the lock. Well, that went nicely, Emily sighed, dropping her head to her folded arms on the table. I just want to do what's best for him. You don't suppose we could take William the doorman with us, do you? She felt strong hands at her shoulders, kneading gently, and gave a little shiver as the tight muscles began to release. Is that the friend Alec is talking about? He asked. The man who was at the wedding today? Yes. I'll be sad to leave William behind, too, to be honest. He's been so kind to me for the last 3 years I've lived here. He doesn't have any family anymore, just the tenants in this building. I'm afraid it'll be like losing a grandfather to say goodbye to him. Emily felt him drop a kiss on top of her head. Don't worry, Brodie said. Everything will work out for the best. Have some faith. She lifted her face to look up at him, standing over her. You're a nice guy, Mr. Callahan. How is it that you haven't made it to the altar before now? Just waiting for you, apparently. He smiled and leaned down to softly kiss her lips. I'll be right back. She watched him head down the hall to the bathroom, knock, and say something quietly to Alec. Alec opened the door and came out, and the two of them went into Emily's bedroom, Brodie's hand on the boy's shoulder. She couldn't hear what they were talking about, but she heard enough to know that Alec was at least responding to Brodie. She pressed a hand to her chest where her heart still fluttered from his sweet kiss. If her reactions to him were anything to go by, they might be able to make this into a good marriage. She just hoped they were also going to be good parents. Are you asleep yet? Darlin', we just climbed into bed 2 minutes ago, and if you hadn't noticed, you can hear, and feel, the subway very well from here. Brodie's smoky laugh filled the small room. I'm used to not seeing lights or hearing car horns or people yelling on the sidewalk or subway trains or really anything but the occasional moo or neigh before I fall asleep. Her bridal nerves eased just a bit at his teasing tone. But not completely. What did you talk to Alec about tonight? Emily asked, squeezed up against the wall, since her double bed seemed much smaller, with a large cowboy in it. She could smell the aftershave he'd splashed on after his shower earlier. It gave her a warm feeling in her stomach, but this wasn't the time for. What would you call it? A marriage consummation? She hoped he understood that. The apartment was just too small, and they had a child to think of, after all. Plus, she was a virgin, and, married or not, she still didn't feel ready. Not much, came Brodie's voice in the dim room. We had a man-to-man chat is all. He seemed calmer when we went out for pizza. Whatever you said must have done some good. We'll see, Brodie murmured. I'm just planning on taking things one day at a time. Speaking of a day at a time, there's something I wanted to talk to you about. Would you be at all offended if I asked to wait until we know each other better? To have sex? You're a beautiful woman, and I already like you, but I'd like to be sure our marriage has a deeper foundation first. She let out the breath she didn't know she'd been holding in a laugh. Thank you for putting that into words. I feel the same way. Not that I'm not incredibly attracted to you. He chuckled and rolled over in the dark. She felt the bedspring squeak and smelled the peppermint of his toothpaste. The feeling is most definitely mutual. There is one thing, though, Brodie said, and she could make out his face close to hers. I do consider kissing a good way to get to know someone. His breath fanned across her cheek, and his lips brushed hers almost questioningly. I'll have to remember not to introduce you to any of my friends, she teased, before putting her lips to his. They were firm and warm, and her own tingled in response. He leaned up on one elbow, putting his other hand to her face. His palm was nearly cool against her hot cheek, and she rubbed against it with a little purr in the back of her throat. He changed the angle of the kiss, deepening it for a moment, dipping his tongue between her parted lips, before breaking away with a strangled laugh. I think that's probably enough for now, Mrs. Callahan, or I'm going to forget that we're practically strangers. Brodie collapsed back on his own pillow and stared at the ceiling, thanking God with a half-formed prayer that his sweet wife was so much more than he'd bargained for. For a man who had never been to New York City before, her husband sure did have a lot of mysterious errands to run, Emily thought a little irritably. He'd been gone a good part of the day, while she'd spent hours boxing things to donate to charity, and packing what little she planned to take to Tennessee. They were leaving the following day, and there were still 1,000,001 things to get done, it seemed. She'd already quit her job at the yoga studio. That one had lasted only 3 weeks, she mused, but her boss wasn't angry with her, since she'd recommended a good friend who was licensed as a yoga instructor, and the two had immediately hit it off. She'd even given Emily a surprise bonus on her check as a thank you, which paid off that pesky electric bill. Her furniture was all gone, having been picked up the day before by the Salvation Army, and since it was summer and Alec hadn't been enrolled in school yet, she didn't have to worry about that. However, she could really use some help cleaning the place, so she'd get her deposit back. She'd even been abandoned by Alec, who was downstairs talking William's ear off, as he had been for the last 4 days. Some partnership, she thought, blowing a curl out of her eyes that had escaped from the handkerchief she'd tied it all back in. The men get to play while the woman does all the work, she told herself to chill out. After all, it was probably just PMS. Picking up the packing tape, she sliced her pinky finger on the cutting edge and threw the dispenser across the room. It bounced off the door, just as Brodie walked in. Whoa, hey there, he laughed. What was that for? Emily didn't reply, just narrowed her eyes at him and stuck the bleeding finger in her mouth. Wisely, Brodie figured it was a great time to pull the flowers out that he'd hidden behind his back. He'd bought them on a whim from a woman down the street who looked down on her luck and had been selling the bouquets from a cardboard box. He was so happy with his progress that day, he'd even paid her twice what the flowers were worth and was rewarded with a nearly toothless grin and a wink. Thanks, sweetheart, she'd drawled in a raspy voice, and her rusty laugh had followed him down the block. Sure enough, the battle light in Emily's eyes softened a little when she saw the pink roses. Are those for me? I bought them for Alec, but he'll probably let you share them. Shaking her head at his lame attempt at humor, she got up stiffly from the floor and went to the kitchen to see if she could find an unpacked vase. Brodie's arm slipped around her waist as she was rising to her tiptoes to get one that was tucked in the back of an upper cupboard. His muscular arm reached up beside hers, and he pulled it down easily. Don't I even get a thank you? He asked, mischievously kissing the side of her neck. Emily's bad mood evaporated into an instant cloud of steam, and she turned around in his arms, fastening her mouth to his. Before they could get too hot and bothered, though, the apartment door flew open, and Alec galloped in like a clumsy puppy. "Aunt Emily, guess what? Also, you." He made a face when he saw their embrace. Emily was too astounded that Alec was addressing her directly and not in monotone to do more than gape at him. "William's coming with us." "What?" She looked at Alec's beaming face. "Oh, hon, I'm not sure that's—" "It's true," Brodie said, stepping to the side to face the boy, but leaving an arm around her shoulder. "You guys, William is a person, not a stray puppy. You can't just—" "It's already settled." Alec's face was split in a happy grin, and it transformed him. Emily realized that it was the first time she'd seen him smile, and the resemblance to Faith at the same age just about broke her heart. "He's going to follow us down to Tennessee in a couple of weeks, after he gets all of his stuff arranged." Brodie's arm tightened just a little bit on Emily's shoulder in a reassuring squeeze. "So, I wasn't going to say anything until I had worked out all the details, but when you said William didn't have a family, and he told me at the luncheon he was raised on a farm actually near Wolf Creek, in Cosby, and knows horses. The farmhouse has 6 bedrooms, plus a mother-in-law apartment above the garage, and he and Alec are so attached already. I know it was a weird idea. I'm sorry I didn't ask you first, but it all seemed like too much of a coincidence." "There's no such thing as coincidences." Dr. Lachele's words at the wedding suddenly popped into her head, and yeah, asking a man he barely knew to move hundreds of miles away with his brand-new, just met at the altar wife and nephew by marriage was kind of a weird thing for Brodie to do. But also very, very sweet. Emily just shook her head and looked at him in wonder. "You are really something, you know that?" His face reddened, and he shuffled his feet almost exactly like her 10-year-old nephew. She threw up her hands. "Here I thought I'd be the impulsive one. I guess we're adopting William. And if you both hadn't remembered, we leave first thing in the morning, so," she poked Brodie in his hard belly, "you help me get these boxes out of here. And you," she pointed at Alec, "get a vacuum and the Windex and do the floor and windows in the bedroom. We're all camping out on blankets tonight." "Yes, ma'am," Alec and Brodie echoed at the same time, eliciting 2 snorts of masculine amusement. "Lord, help me," Emily thought ruefully. She had gone from being responsible for only herself to, overnight almost, overseeing 2, no, 3, men. He sure worked in mysterious ways. Chapter 4. The mountains were gorgeous. Unlike the sharp, treeless peaks she remembered from a long-ago road trip to Colorado with a friend's family, the Smokies looked softer, with their peaks mostly shrouded in trees. So many trees. Trees were all Emily could see, actually, and she was already missing the skyscrapers. They had made the trip in the crew cab pickup truck Brodie had bought on one of his excursions during their last couple of days in New York. It wasn't new, but it was nice, and not for the first time, Emily wondered how much money her new husband had. It seemed rude to ask even though they were married. She'd have happily told him that she had $36.72 in her checking account, but he hadn't asked her about her finances either. She looked at his profile in the bright sunshine as he maneuvered the truck through a steep, downward curve of yet another mountain. Instead of looking exhausted after 9.5 hours of driving, the closer they came to their destination, the brighter his blue eyes got. Alec was passed out in the back seat. She wondered if he ever did anything besides sleep, eat, and read, and she'd been trying to read a romance novel for the last hour but had only turned about 3 pages. "So, tell me again what you're planning on doing with this farm?" He looked toward her and smiled widely. "I'm going to raise thoroughbreds," he said. Emily felt a little shiver. Horses were big. And scary. She'd been bit by a neighbor's horse when she was only 7, and ever since, she'd always been afraid of him, but, judging by the excitement on Brodie's face, she was going to have to get over that childhood fear, and quick. She pushed the thought away to worry about later. "I was saving it for a surprise, but when we were at the rest stop a little while ago, I got a call from my old boss, Ryder. He's thanking us for the miracle of a happy newborn by buying us our first pair of breeding horses." "Wait, what?" Emily laughed. "How in the world did we do that?" He told her about how Ryder and Willa had been matched up by Dr. Lachele and had recently celebrated their first child. He also told her how little Raven had made her presence known to the world by crying non-stop all the time. When Dr. Lachele came to do her matrimony interview with me, apparently she had a heart-to-heart with Raven. Ever since I left with Lachele, Raven has been the most peaceful baby in the world. Emily snorted. You'd think that Ryder would have shown his gratitude to Dr. Lachele instead of us. He tried, Brodie answered, slowing down to make a right-hand turn. She was the one that suggested that he buy us the horses, and he's calling it an investment. He wants to be a long-distance partner. Oh, look. He pointed out the driver's side window and nearly stomped on the brakes. Is that what I think it is? Emily asked, her heart pounding. A large black shape lumbered alongside the rocky stream on the other side of the road. Toddling along behind it were two smaller shapes. Yep, a mama black bear and her cubs. He accelerated slowly, still glancing at the trio. I guess we shouldn't stop like tourists to look at every bear we see. We'd never make it to our new house. You mean there are more of those around here? Emily felt dumb, but she'd never considered the possibility that she might have bears for neighbors. Her foster parents' house had practically been suburban, compared to this wilderness. Aren't they dangerous? Not really, Brodie assured her. She wasn't convinced. They tend to be more afraid of people than anything else. Just don't get between a mama bear and her cubs. Not even by accident. Get between them? Emily asked, half joking. I don't think I'll even be leaving the house. I'd be too scared to run into one. Not 10 minutes later, the GPS on the dash sang out, you have reached your destination. What destination? She almost asked the question out loud. Emily just saw more trees and a dirt road. Don't you think we should have driven through a town at some point recently? She asked instead. I thought the property description said something about nearby shopping and nightlife. Brodie's face dimmed a little. Is that what you want? He asked as he turned onto the dirt track. Not necessarily, Emily hurried to reassure him, trying to keep an open mind. I just want to know that the option is there, I guess. The driveway was steep, and with all the bumps and washed-out areas, the jostling woke Alec. Where are we? He asked groggily. Home, Brodie announced proudly. The trees opened up suddenly, and as advertised, there were picturesque white fences enclosing overgrown pasture areas on either side of the drive. They needed a little bit of tending, but at first glance everything looked fine. Farther up were the barns. And beyond that. Brodie felt his mouth literally drop open. Whoa, Alec mumbled from the back seat, that thing looks haunted. It really did. No wonder the listing agent had posted such a blurry picture. Gravel crunched under the truck tires as he parked on the circular driveway in front of the building. Brodie looked quickly at Emily to see her reaction, but she didn't notice. She was too busy taking it all in. Slowly, she stepped out of the truck. Maybe it's not as bad as it looks, he said in a shaky voice, mostly to himself. Yeah, right, came Alec's voice from behind him. Uneven pavers led to a wide, wooden front porch that listed drunkenly to one side. Paint had long ago peeled and flaked away from the posts. Windows across the ivy-covered brick face of the house were cracked, broken, or just plain missing. Should we see if there's another way in? Emily asked hesitantly, a determined smile pinned to her lips. That porch doesn't look like it would hold a big guy like you. Let's go see if there's a back door. She headed off with purposeful steps. Emily couldn't help but wonder what in the world her husband had been thinking by buying this farm online, sight unseen, but it seemed like it would be rude to point that out right now. Judging by the baffled look on his face, Brodie would come to that realization on his own pretty soon. She kept up a steady stream of chatter as she picked her way through fallen branches and knee-high grass, heading toward the far corner of the brick monstrosity. To the left, she saw a garage that looked in much better shape than the rest of the house, and above it, a small apartment. Let's check that out first, Emily said, injecting some cheer into her voice. The garage itself was old but sturdy, and the stairs didn't even creak as she climbed them to the apartment. The door was unlocked and swung open when she pushed it. The small apartment had apparently been added above the garage sometime in 1973, since the floors sported thick, gold shag carpeting, and the walls were a foil-embossed wallpaper she had only seen in pictures. One open room made up the living room, kitchen and dining room, and 3 doors led off into separate rooms. Everything was clean, and there was only a slight odor of disuse. She pushed open a window to let some fresh air in as Brodie and Alec trooped in the door behind her. "Pretty," Brodie muttered sarcastically, running a finger around the avocado-colored sink. Alec had already checked out the 3 doorways. 2 bedrooms and a bathroom, he announced. "Well, then, we can stay here in case the main house needs repairs before we move in," Emily answered. Privately, she figured that whoever had owned this farm had lived here, rather than the crumbling house next door. Alec frowned. "No, this will be William's apartment." She didn't argue with him. After Alec had perked up with the announcement that his friend would be staying with them, he had withdrawn again, as if afraid to get too excited about anything. "William will probably really like it," she said instead. So, she cast a glance at Brodie. "Let's check out our new home." There was a back door that led into a kitchen area, and Emily, having taken charge of the expedition, entered first. She squealed loudly and backed up, running into Brodie. His arms came around her protectively as he moved to shield her. "What is it?" he rumbled, his voice vibrating against her back. Inside the kitchen, sitting up on his hind legs and blinking up at them owlishly, sat a small raccoon. He didn't seem bothered by the company, just dropped back to all fours and waddled away. "I'm sorry," Emily said, giggling as relief spread through her. "I thought it was a bear." "A really small one." Brodie didn't seem so amused as he took in the disrepair in the kitchen. Linoleum floors were cracked and peeling. Cupboard doors hung drunkenly from broken hinges to show dusty, cobwebby dishes still in them. Drunken seemed to be a pattern with this house. The huge, white farmhouse sink still had a thick layer of grime on it that had turned it gray and rusty brown, and there were antique dishes waiting in the sink as if to be washed, left by some long-ago housewife who never returned. Judging by the appliances and the huge refrigerator, the kitchen hadn't seen an upgrade since the 1940s. "It's retro," Emily said. "I haven't seen a fridge like that, ever. I kind of like it." Silently, Brodie walked through the kitchen, broken tile crunching under his boots. Under his gray t-shirt, his shoulders hunched. Alec and Emily followed him. "Check it out," Emily commented, trying to keep things positive as they entered the dining room. "I bet you didn't know this place came fully furnished." A dining room table, at least 10 feet long, took up a large part of the room, and a chandelier, festively draped with spider webs and dirty crystal teardrops, hung overhead. There were chairs with rotting upholstery, a huge sideboard, and a china cabinet. "This place is totally haunted," Alec said in a low voice, but a thread of excitement ran through his words. The living room was next. Camelback sofas with what looked like horsehair spilling out of ripped seams, a large piano that gave an eerie, tinkling note when Alec plunked a key. A formal parlor, the velvet drapes sagging on old hardware, black and white photos and faded paintings decorating the walls, crackling leaves blown in through an empty window pane. A library, smelling of musty leather and old books. A staircase led upstairs, the carpeted runner threadbare and dirty, covered with animal droppings. Upstairs were the bedrooms, a few that might have belonged to children, with abandoned toys and sagging brass bed frames. The master bedroom was dominated by a dark wood 4-poster bed, its canopy rotted and drooping. A nursery held cribs and small, child-sized furniture, caked with dirt. The bathroom, even Emily shuddered, backing out quickly, had a massive clawfoot bathtub, with a fist-sized spider lounging in the center, surrounded by dried bug carcasses. Emily snuck another glance at Brodie. His face was set and tight, and he suddenly turned and stalked down the hallway. She looked at Alec, but his face showed only interest as he opened doors and inspected closets. "You okay in here?" "I'm going to go talk to Brodie a sec." "Sure," Alec muttered. "Cool, an attic." He disappeared up the stairs. "Be careful," Emily called after him. Feeling torn between keeping an eye on him and reassuring Brodie, she hurried after Brodie, resolving to keep it quick and then come back and check on Alec. Brodie was sitting outside on the lopsided front porch steps when she found him, his baseball hat clutched in his hands, staring at the ground. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know it would be like this." Her heart squeezed at his obviously dejected attitude. "Oh, snap out of it, cowboy," she said briskly. "It's a challenge, that's all. Do you back down from grumpy cows, or whatever, the first time you get kicked?" He raised an eyebrow, his blue eyes sparkling a little with reluctant humor. "That's the best ranch analogy you've got? What do you want from me?" she demanded, cocking a hip and putting her fist on it. "I'm a city girl." His face fell again. "That's right. And I married you and dragged you away from Park Avenue to live in backwoods Tennessee in a falling-down house in the middle of the woods." She rolled her eyes. "Quit feeling sorry for yourself. I wasn't exactly living the high life there, and I'm always up for trying something new." Brodie's head fell back, his longish hair brushing his collar as he looked up at the house towering behind them. "This isn't new. This is old. Old and moldy. Whatever. You know what I mean." She grabbed his calloused hand, pulling him to his feet. "Let's go find Alec. He's probably lost in there, and we don't know where that raccoon went. Then we'll dump our stuff in the apartment for now and go find pizza and a grocery store, in that order. Even backwoods Tennessee has to have a pizza place somewhere, and I'm going to need some serious cleaning supplies if I'm supposed to turn our house into a home." He watched Emily as she trotted back toward the kitchen entrance, her cute little curve set off by the blue jeans she wore. Her red hair shone in the afternoon light like a beacon, trailing down her back in a curly ponytail. He wondered how long it would take even her upbeat, optimistic attitude to waver in the face of the disaster his farm was turning out to be. How quickly would she miss her old life and want to get back to New York? Emily had no idea where to begin. Technically, she had everything she needed. Her hair was tied back in a cute green bandana. The flower-covered apron she'd picked up from their whirlwind excursion to Walmart the day before was adorable and made her feel very housewifely. It covered her cleaning outfit, a pair of designer denim capris she'd bought at a consignment shop in Manhattan and a green V-neck t-shirt, from neck to knees. She had mops, brooms, trash bags, buckets, rags, cleaner, soap, and even water, and electricity, thanks to her talented husband's tinkering with the utilities in the basement the night before. Emily just didn't know if she had the guts to get started. The kitchen was the worst room in the house, which wasn't saying much, and despite her assurances to Brodie before she'd sent him off on his way to the barns, she had no idea what the heck to do. She would have liked the help but figured the house was going to be her domain, and anyway, they had horses being delivered in a few days who also needed a place to live. She would have recruited Alec, but he insisted on getting the garage apartment ready for William. So, she was on her own, and the only way to eat an elephant was one bite at a time, she reminded herself. She picked up the broom and swept the floor, pulling up the loose tiles and dropping them in a big, black garbage bag. That kicked up loads of dust, so she wrestled the old windows open, letting in some of the summer mountain air. She stood back, hands on her hips, but the kitchen didn't look any closer to being usable. Shrugging, Emily started on the sink, gingerly lifting out dishes and setting them wherever there was room on the counter. When it was empty, the sink looked large enough to bathe a toddler in. She got out some abrasive scrubber and scoured until her fingers ached, finally sitting back and beaming at the gleam on the white porcelain. Checking her watch, she realized she'd already been at it an hour, and she had one clean white sink and one ratty-looking subfloor to show for it. It was time for a break. She was sitting on the front step with a cold iced tea she'd grabbed from the cooler when Brodie came walking up the drive, whistling. "Heya, sweetheart," he teased, spotting her. "You done with that kitchen yet?" Calmly, Emily screwed the cap back on her plastic bottle and chucked the nearly empty tea at him as hard as she could. She hadn't forgotten her Little League pitching days. The bottle caught him neatly in the stomach, and he grunted with an exaggerated oof before uncapping it and swigging the rest of the tea. "I'm just teasing, darlin' dot." He winked. She crossed her arms and glared. "I got the sink clean." That's good, Brodie said, easing cautiously down on the step next to her. Are you sure you don't want me to hire someone to come in and help? Yes, Emily wanted to yell, but pride stopped her. She was going to tackle this housewife thing and make it work, darn it. No worries, sugar britches, she teased back. I'll have this whole place clean in a matter of days. A lot of days, she added silently. He eyed her with concern. Just don't wear yourself out. Leaning over, he brushed a sweet kiss over her lips and tweaked a curl that escaped from her bandana. I don't want you taking on too much. As she watched Brodie walk toward his truck, his lanky stride self-confident and sure, Emily promised herself that she wouldn't rest until their old house was polished and restored to its original glory. She knew that she had a tendency to get excited about new projects, only to abandon them when things got tough, but this would be different. She wouldn't disappoint him. Chapter 5. Over dinner that night, Brodie studied Emily. She looked exhausted. He'd only been joking when he'd asked her that morning if the kitchen was finished, but she seemed to have taken his words as a personal challenge. Her adorable face had been smudged with dust, and there was a cobweb hanging from the hem of the apron she wore, now dirty beyond recognition, but she'd given him a brilliant smile and shooed him on to the garage apartment. Eat without me, she'd said, and have Alec bring me a screwdriver, will you? Phillips or flathead? And what size, he'd asked. She just looked at him blankly for a second, and he decided to let her off the hook. I'll just have him bring a selection. Brodie had spent the rest of the afternoon down in the fields, repairing fences, while Alec had wandered around, watching him quietly or playing in the rocky stream that ran through the meadow. When they returned to the house for dinner, his muscles were sore, but he welcomed it. Aches from a hard day's work were the best kind. Emily, however, didn't look like she shared that opinion. She'd finally finished the kitchen, to her relief. It was amazing to see that beneath the dirt and grime, the high-ceilinged room actually had some potential. She'd washed all the antique dishes, which included thick pottery plates with clever patterns and very few chips, and pink and green glass pieces that dated back who knew how many years, stacking them in the scrubbed cupboards that she'd removed the doors and hinges from. They sparkled prettily in the afternoon sunshine. The counters were clean, too, as well as the antique stove, with all its little compartments, and the refrigerator, with its curvy, rounded corners, that turned out to be pink instead of dirty beige, and the walls were washed up as high as she could reach with the little stepladder she'd found. She'd started a list of repairs that they'd need, too, and so far had window screens and new tile. By the time 5 o'clock rolled around, she felt like she needed a 4-hour nap. But she'd had menfolk to feed. Emily had hustled over to the apartment, quickly cleaned up, and started a double batch of hamburger helper by 6 in the evening. She winced at the idea of what a real country wife would probably say about convenience meals, but she couldn't afford to feel guilty. It was all she knew how to cook, and she was too tired to try and fake something. Not that either of the males seemed to notice what she fed them. They just scarfed down the food as fast as they could. I'm going back outside, Alec said, leaving his dirty plate on the shag-carpeted floor, where they had eaten their dinner, picnic style, and headed for the door. I've got to run to Newport for some tools, so I can fix that stable door, Brodie announced, leaving his plate on the floor as well. I should only be gone an hour and a half or so. Do you need anything? He hardly paused to hear if she responded on his way out the door. More hamburger helper? Emily asked weakly after he'd left. She collapsed backward on the floor, her muscles aching. Or maybe a body transplant? All she wanted to do was sleep, even though the only bed she had to look forward to consisted of sleeping bags on top of carpet. But if she hurried and did the dishes, she might be able to start on the dining room yet tonight. The next week fell into a predictable pattern that left Emily wanting to scream. She got up early, made the boys, as she was starting to think of them, breakfast, cereal, cleaned up after them, and then headed over to the house to clean, breaking only for lunch and dinner to feed the boys again. Emily despised cleaning. It was endless. There was just so much house to deal with, and she missed her cozy little apartment that she could polish top to bottom in a weekend afternoon. She refused to give up, though, and every time Brodie asked if he could find someone to help, she just ignored the jabs of irritation she felt. Didn't he think she was doing a good enough job, and worked harder? Her muscles ached constantly. Thankfully, Brodie had brought back air mattresses from his supply trip to town on their second night, so at least she didn't have to sleep on the floor, but Emily understood she was under a deadline. William would be arriving the following week. He and Alec chatted on the phone nearly every night, and she wanted to have his apartment ready and vacated by the time he got to the farm. So, she gritted her teeth and moved on to the upstairs bedrooms. She had just begun to drag out the musty old mattresses that sat on top of the beautiful four-poster bed when she heard a scrabbling of tiny nails on the hardwood floor. Used to mice by now, Emily wasn't scared. But when the first chipmunk ran up her pant leg, she became concerned. When a second joined it, she started to scream. Emily hopped around the room, mortally terrified that she'd feel razor-sharp little teeth bite into her derriere at any moment. Trying to peel her jeans off and wiggle the chipmunks out at the same time, she finally got the pants off, still shrieking, but the chipmunks had migrated north. "Get out, get out, get out," she yelled, stripping off her t-shirt and shaking the furry critters loose. She could have sworn they laughed at her, looking back for a moment and making chattering noises before disappearing through the doorway. Emily growled in frustration. "Do you need help?" Of course it was Brodie, here to witness her chipmunk-induced humiliation. Emily blushed hot pink and tried to stretch her t-shirt out to cover her dingy white bra and granny panties. This was not how she wanted her handsome husband to see her unclothed for the first time. "Nope, I'm fine," she answered too quickly. "If you could just close the door on your way." Brodie's eyes lit with a mischievous look. "You mean like this?" He stepped into the bedroom and shut the door behind him. Her eyes automatically ran down his long, lean form, clad in a pair of khaki cargo shorts and a worn thin, button-down blue work shirt that matched his eyes. She realized he was returning her inspection and felt herself blushing further as he took in what wasn't covered by the dirty gray t-shirt that she clutched to her chest. "Turn around," she demanded. "Like this?" he asked in the same teasing voice as he walked around her, forcing Emily to turn with him. "Is this why you won't let me in the house when you're cleaning? Because you like to scrub floors in your undies? For your information, I had chipmunks in my pants." She said the words soberly, but inside, Emily was about to explode into laughter. The whole situation was just so ludicrous. "Chipmunks, Brodie nodded in all seriousness and took a step closer to her. "Chipmunks are one of the most dangerous predators in Tennessee. You need to watch out for them. Once they climb up your pant legs, you're just about doomed." A helpless giggle escaped. "Knock it off, Brodie." "Oh, no," Brodie replied, taking another step toward her. "You're lucky to have survived. Tennessee chipmunks are notorious for." He advanced another step. "Tickling their victims to death." With that, he wiggled his fingers and went for her ribs, and she squealed with laughter. "Let me go. This is ridiculous." She dodged to the right to avoid his playful moves, but he shifted at the last moment, and she collided with him. He caught her in his arms and pulled her close. "Mrs. Callahan," Brodie murmured, his eyes growing hot, "you probably should put some clothes on. Otherwise, I'll be tempted to toss you on that bed, there, and get to know you better right now." Emily had always been self-conscious about her body. She knew she was just a little shorter and just a little rounder than the ideal woman, and normally, she dressed as stylishly and funky as she could to boost her self-esteem. But here was this gorgeous, generous, kind-hearted man, cradling her in his arms as if she were the most precious thing in the world, even though practically all he'd seen her in since the wedding were grungy jeans and t-shirts. Just knowing that he was attracted to her despite her lack of polish made Emily feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. Right now, though, with Alec somewhere in the house, and Emily and Brodie very conscious of them having been too busy to truly get to know each other like they had planned, it just wasn't the right time. She rose on her tiptoes to angle her lips over his. Steadily moving him backward, she reached the doorway as his eyes closed, and he gave himself up to her kiss. In one swift movement, she opened the door and gave him a light shove that sent him reeling backward. "Mr. Callahan," she said sweetly. "Getting dressed was exactly what I was trying to do." and she shut the door firmly in his face. Alec sat on the dusty attic floor, the sun shining through the dormers that marched down either side of the long, narrow room. A breeze blew in through the round windows he'd propped open at both ends. "Come here, Bandit," he crooned, holding a little bit of cereal in the palm of his hand that he'd snuck into his pocket at breakfast. He'd been sitting motionless for a half hour while the little raccoon studied him out of bright, intelligent black eyes. Finally, as he was about to give up and go back outside, the raccoon dropped to all fours and started moving toward him, slowly. Alec held perfectly still, and the raccoon sniffed for a moment, whiskers twitching and black eyes alert, before reaching out her paws to grab some of the food. Just then, a muffled shout came from downstairs where his aunt was working, and the raccoon skittered back to its hiding place behind a packing crate. Darn it. But when Alec heard Brodie's deep voice, and then more laughter, he smiled. Emily and Brodie were always doing dumb stuff. Laughing and joking and making eyes at each other. They just kind of let Alec do his own thing, though, which was fine because that was how he wanted to keep things, and everyone was busy, and it wasn't like he wanted to pretend to be their son or anything. But it still made him feel lonely. Maybe when school started. No, he couldn't make friends. They were too hard to leave behind. He thought maybe Bandit would be a good pet, and they could keep each other company, but that wasn't working either. But William would be here next week, and then at least he'd have someone to hang out with. He was renting a little trailer for his things, and he promised to bring his whole book collection and his World War II memorabilia. In the meantime, Alec could explore the woods and the attic like he had been. He didn't need anybody else. Well, that wasn't true. He needed his mom. He felt tears burn at the backs of his eyes. He was having a harder time remembering her now. The way her gray eyes lit up when she saw him. The way she smelled when she hugged him tight. But he was starting to be able to remember her the way she was when he was little, back when she called him goofy nicknames, like Boo Bear. Before she got so sick and died. Before she left him. He brushed the tears off his cheeks and absently crumbled the corn flakes. A little rustling noise caught his attention. Standing in front of Alec, just like she'd been waiting for him to quit looking at her before she finally approached him, was Bandit. She sniffed at the crumbs and inched closer, looking up at him as if she wanted permission. "Go ahead," he whispered, a smile starting on his face. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want a friend." Sunday morning dawned bright and sunny, and Emily stretched for a moment before opening her eyes. Her muscles spasmed in protest, and she groaned. "You okay?" Brodie's sleepy voice came from the other side of the room, where he slept on an air mattress of his own. "Of course," she replied cheerily, but winced as she rolled over to get up. "I'm just going to go try and make some pancakes or something for breakfast, before I head over to the house." Just the thought of fixing breakfast, even from a mix, and cleaning yet another room made Emily want to scream and run the opposite direction, but she couldn't afford to lose any time. "Nope, not today," her husband said firmly, sitting up. The sleeping bag he was using as a comforter slid down his chest with a nearly silent hiss, and it was all Emily could do to keep her eyes from drifting down to that muscled chest, lightly dusted with hair. Brodie was a muscular man, and curiosity itched at her to see if the rest of him was as tan as the top half. "What do you mean, not today?" she asked, pulling her eyes back up to his face. "I've got a ton of stuff to do still." "Not on Sunday, you don't. If a day of rest was good enough for God, it's good enough for us." "Do you go to church normally?" Emily asked curiously, sitting back down on the edge of her bed. She'd heard him talk about God a couple of times before, like God was a person he knew well and liked, but she didn't know if Brodie was religious. He flushed a little. "Not since I was a kid." "I didn't mean to embarrass you," Emily said softly. "I just figured if we want to get to know each other, we should talk about everything." "You didn't embarrass me." Brodie grinned. "You're blushing," she pointed out. "I don't know why." Brodie shrugged. "Just not used to talking about it, I guess. My faith is just a part of me. I was raised Christian, and God was just always there. He's been incredibly good to me, too. He brought me you." Now it was Emily's turn to blush, and she brushed her hair back from her face self-consciously. "What about you?" he asked curiously. "I believe in God," she answered after a thoughtful moment. "My foster parents went to church every Sunday, and I was so young when they took us in that I accepted their faith without question. My sister? Not so much. I found comfort in the thought that our parents were with him, but she never got over the fact that he took them from us in the first place. Anyway," she ended brusquely, rising to her feet, "this is deep conversation for first thing in the morning. If you don't want me to attempt pancakes, what would you like to do this morning?" "If you don't mind," Brodie said, "I think I'd like to go to church. And breakfast after, of course. Let someone else do the cooking for a change." Emily was a little hesitant as she woke Alec up and told him to get ready. She knew her sister hadn't been a churchgoer and wasn't sure if she'd passed on her beliefs to her son. But Alec, tousle-haired and sleepy-eyed, was dressed and ready in a nice polo shirt and khaki shorts just a few minutes later. She could read nothing but mild curiosity on his face. "Are we going to any place in particular?" Emily asked as they bumped down the driveway in Brodie's truck. "I saw a small church not far from us on my way into town yesterday," Brodie answered. "It's about 3 miles down the road. I'm not sure what denomination it is, but the sign by the road said, 'Visitors Welcome.'" The country church, Emily was delighted to see, was a small, white-sided structure nestled into a hollow in the mountain as though it had been there for 100 years. Even Alec was interested, leaning forward from the back seat to get a better look. The dirt parking lot was almost full, but only held around 30 cars. "This looks like it used to be a one-room schoolhouse. I'm glad it's not bigger. I'd be nervous walking into one of those megachurches we saw from the highway on the way down here." She hadn't been to church since she was in her late teens, and felt a surprising sense of homecoming as they walked up the wooden front steps. The doors were thrown open in welcome, and the minister, a tall nice-looking man in his 40s, shook their hands and introduced himself as Tom. The woman beside him, Lainey, was short and curvy, with a warm smile and a sweet southern accent. She shooed them in through the doors like a mother hen. "Come on in, y'all. What are your names? Are you new around here? Did you buy the old Ferguson farm?" They were hardly given a chance to answer as the minister's wife pulled them through the door. "We've got some newbies here," she called out cheerfully to the congregation. Several faces turned toward them as people gave them friendly smiles. "Why don't y'all go sit there with Becca?" Alone in the farthest back pew, a young woman who looked to be in around Emily's age sat wearing a faded but pretty dress and shyly looked up and smiled from behind the partial curtain of her honey blonde hair. "Hi," she nearly whispered as Emily scooted in next to her, followed by Brodie, and then Alec. "I'm Emily. It's nice to meet you." She held out her hand, and the woman shook it, dropping her eyes again when she was done. "I'm Becca. Nice to meet you, too," she said to her lap. Emily's heart went out to the painfully shy girl, but before she could say more, the elderly pianist struck up a rousing hymn. The sermon that followed was uplifting and interesting, and, all too quickly, it was over. Afterward, in the rush of greetings from other parishioners, Emily looked for Becca, but she had disappeared. Over a stack of pancakes at a small bustling restaurant in Newport after church, Brodie announced that they were going to spend the rest of the day exploring the woods. Alec's face lit with excitement when he looked up from his omelet. "I found some really cool trails that run through the property," he exclaimed before he could remember to be aloof. Emily found herself picturing tall trees and big rocks that hid dangerous, slobbering bears, and tried not to wince. "That sounds amazing," she said instead. "You'll have to show us," Brodie added. "We've been so busy working around the place that neither one of us has had any time to just have fun." He snuck a look at Emily, realizing that in their decision to give Alec some space and being caught up in their own concerns, they had let the boy back away too much. Emily gave a slight nod to let him know she knew what he was thinking. "We'll stop at the grocery store," she promised, "and you can help me pick out some stuff for a picnic. We'll make a day of it, just the 3 of us." Alec nodded, grinning briefly before digging back into his breakfast, but Brodie just sat back in his chair. It was a heck of a thing, he thought, watching the boy eat as though it was his first meal in days even though he always ate that hungrily, and then looking to his wife, so pretty in a stylish sundress, with her curly red hair and sparkling green eyes. In just a couple of short weeks, he went from being alone to having a family. It was a heck of a thing. Chapter 6. Mondays were the worst, in Emily's opinion. Sunday had been a fun day, full of lazy relaxation on the farm. No chores, no cooking, just hanging out and exploring the woods with Brodie and Alec. Thankfully, she hadn't been bit by any bugs, and she hadn't seen a single bear, despite keeping a sharp watch. Alec had been a completely different boy, full of mischief and so much like she remembered her sister, Faith. He had her streak of quirky humor, especially noticeable when he'd popped up from behind a big boulder and lobbed a clump of mud from the bank of the stream at Brodie. It caught him completely by surprise, splattering against his cheek, and the look of astonishment on his face was comical. Thankfully her husband had taken the attack in stride, roaring playfully and chasing Alec down to shove a handful of the glop down the back of the giggling boy's shirt. Emily managed to stay clean and out of the line of the fire, but nearly wet her pants laughing at their antics. Dinner was easy, for a change. Brodie and Alec had run into town to pick up a bucket of fried chicken, leaving Emily to get some reading time in the shade of an old oak in the front yard, but today was another day. She'd woken up on the wrong side of the air mattress, it seemed. Emily did not want to go back over to the main house for another day of sweat and dust and dirt. If this had been any other job, she would have quit by now. She was sick of strained muscles and spiders and mouse droppings, and, for as much work as she had done, there was still mountains of it left to do. She sat on the steps to the garage apartment, glaring at the big brick monstrosity that was supposed to be inhabitable by now, over her morning cup of coffee. The weather seemed to echo her mood. Dark clouds were building overhead, and there was a distant grumble of thunder. Behind her, the screen door opened with a sharp creak. "What's up, Buttercup?" Brodie asked cheerfully, settling down beside her on the stair. Emily wanted to warn him to go away. She definitely didn't want to confess that she was tired and grumpy, and probably suffering from some PMS. "This coffee sucks," she burst out instead. "Why can't there be a Starbucks near here?" "I bet you, there's not a Starbucks for 300 miles. He eyed her in surprise, and took a sip from his own steaming mug. "I don't know, I think it's pretty good." "You're definitely getting the hang of that vintage coffee maker in there." "And that's another thing," she burst out. "Why is it always my job to make the coffee?" I'm sorry?" Brodie looked confused, his brows drawing together. "I can start doing that. I didn't realize you didn't like making coffee." Rain started to spatter, making dark spots on the wooden steps around them, and the tree swayed in a fitful breeze. She knew she should just tell Brodie that she needed help in the house, but she didn't want him to think she was a citified sissy and couldn't handle some hard work. "Forget it," Emily muttered, standing up to go back in. "I've got work to do." Brodie watched her go, baffled. Was it something he'd said? After Emily had gathered her things and headed over to the house, Brodie decided his wife was right. She was working too hard, both cleaning and taking care of him. She wasn't used to any of this, and if he wasn't careful, he was going to chase her right back to the city. "Alec, come on out here, kiddo. We've got to talk." Brodie had a to-do list a mile long and wanted to get back to the barn, since his horses were being delivered the next day, but more than that, he wanted Emily back to her happy, bubbling self. "Yeah?" The 10-year-old wandered out of his bedroom, a portable game in his hands. "Shut that off for a sec, will you?" Brodie looked around the apartment. There were clothes scattered around, paper plates on the floor, an empty bucket of chicken on the kitchen counter, and dirty dishes in the sink. Alec looked up at him with a nervous expression, looking nothing like the boy he'd roughhoused with in the woods the day before, and Brodie's heart squeezed. He liked this kid so much, and that was another thing he didn't want to screw up. "Don't worry," he chuckled, trying to ease Alec's tension. "I was just thinking. It's time we started dividing up some chores around here. Too much is falling on Emily, and I think it's starting to get to her." "I heard you guys out on the porch," Alec admitted worriedly. "She sounded pretty mad." "Are you guys fighting? Does she not want to be married anymore?" "Ouch." That was a thought that hit Brodie right in the gut. "No, don't start worrying," Brodie said. "It's nothing like that. But I think it'll help if we men start taking some of the work off her plate." Alec nodded. "I can do that." "No," Brodie corrected with a smile. "We can do that." Emily's day was not getting better. It wasn't even noon, and she'd been chased around the living room by a wolf spider, broken the only intact fingernail she had left, and scratched her arm on a rusty nail sticking out of a doorframe. Her designer denim capris now sported a grease stain down one side of the leg from who knew what, and her very last clean t-shirt was filthy and smelled like BO. The final insult came when she was trying to prop open one of the windows to let some fresh air, and it slid free from her grasp, smashing her thumb. At her howl, Brodie came running. "Ah, hon, what have you done to yourself?" Brodie exclaimed sympathetically, hurrying to get the window open so she could get her hand out. "What have I done?" Emily yelled at him, tears of pain and frustration running down her cheeks as she cradled her throbbing thumb. She was getting cramps now, and just wanted to run the opposite direction, all the way back to New York. "I haven't done anything. You're the one who had the bright idea to buy a house online without even seeing it in person. You're the one who decided we were moving here without any input from me. You're the one who thinks horses are more important than people and can't even help me out just a little even though we have to move in here in 2 flipping days so we can house someone you invited to live with us without even asking me. Whatever happened to we'll handle everything together, Emily?" "Come here," Brodie said quietly. Her words had hurt, but he hated to see her so upset. He held out his arms. "No," she said, sniffling mutinously. "If you don't mind, I'm going to borrow your truck and take myself to the closest Starbucks, and then to a doctor, if I can find either of those things out here in the middle of nowhere. And with my luck, I won't find either of those things even though I probably broke this stupid thumb, and I need a decent mocha like I need my next breath. This never would have happened back home." She held up her hand accusingly, and sure enough, her thumb had already swollen and turned an angry shade of purplish red. This was it. His worst fear. The wife he was falling for was regretting that he'd ever pulled her away from her life in the big city. "Are you sure I can't drive you?" Brodie asked miserably. She shook her head, and he pulled the truck keys out of his pocket, handing them to her cautiously. Emily disappeared down the hallway, leaving Brodie wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. Alec, sitting in an old rocking chair in the attic, with Bandit curled up in a warm heap of fur on his lap, heard the entire argument. It was just like when his mom and her boyfriends would fight. He'd just get to the point where he liked one of them, and next thing you knew, they'd be arguing over a burned dinner or a bill that got paid late, and everything would change again. He and his mom would move, or his mom's boyfriend would leave, and once, his stepdad had divorced his mom. He knew that having so much fun on the picnic yesterday had been a mistake. He was starting to like Aunt Emily and Brodie too much. Emily started up the truck, sniffing back tears. She had to concentrate. She'd only driven occasionally in New York, since everyone there took public transit, and by her best estimate, it had been 5 years since she'd been behind the wheel of a vehicle. Luckily, the truck was an automatic. Driving slowly and carefully, she made it out of the driveway and turned right. She couldn't even ask Google where to go. The cell phone signal was spotty down by the road. The farther away from the farm she got, the worse she started to feel. Picturing Brodie's confused face as she'd yelled at him. She didn't mean anything she'd said. Not really, anyway. Rain was coming down heavily, and her wipers were on full blast when she pulled over near the French Broad River to see if her cell had service. She almost started crying again when she saw that the closest Starbucks was nearly 40 minutes away. It was stupid, the way she was ignoring her finger and dead set on fancy coffee, but she was craving chocolate and the taste of something familiar from the big city she'd called home. At least there was an emergency room close to the coffee shop. The mountains were shrouded in mist, her head hurt from crying, and her thumb ached fiercely. The last thing she wanted was to drive all that way by herself. Emily wanted to turn the truck around, go back, apologize to Brodie, and beg him to go with her. A country wife would be tough, though, and understanding that her husband's work on the farm came first. Besides, it was her fault she was in this situation in the first place, so she set the GPS and pulled back out onto the highway. Brodie made mac and cheese and hot dogs for dinner. It was quiet in the apartment, now clean, and he tried not to pace a rut in the linoleum floor worrying about Emily. For all he knew, she was headed back to New York, but Brodie didn't want to upset Alec by dwelling on that idea. The boy had obviously picked up on some of what was going on because he had his face buried in a book and hadn't said a word for the last hour. And instead of inhaling it, he'd merely picked at his dinner. When gravel crunched in the driveway, they both jumped up and bolted for the window. "She's back." Brodie let out a breath as the truck's headlights cut through the evening fog. "Yeah," Alec said, turning a glare on him, gray eyes baleful. "Now try not to do anything dumb and make her leave again." He headed for his room and slammed the door while Brodie looked on, kind of impressed at the small tantrum. The kid had been downright rude. That was new, and normal, behavior. Privately, he'd been worried at the kid's self-possession. Boys his age were supposed to talk back and act up occasionally, and it was encouraging. He met Emily at the door, ready to apologize. It didn't matter who started the fight or what it was all about. He was ready to promise her anything, just so it didn't happen again. He was so grateful to see her small curvy frame coming up the stairs. One hand was bandaged, and in the other, she held a white and green cup. "It's cold," she said sheepishly, handing it to him when she got to the top of the stairs. "You might have to microwave it, since it traveled about 300 miles to get here." Brodie took the cup and held the door open for her. Raindrops glistened on her hair in the overhead light. He set the cup on the counter, and then turned back to pull her into his arms. Tears had been near the surface all afternoon. Emily always cried at the drop of a hat when her time of the month was near, and when Brodie's strong arms closed around her, they overflowed. "I'm so sorry about the way I acted today," she cried into his shirt. "I never should have said any of that to you. I could blame it on PMS, but I was also just straight up grumpy this morning." His deep chuckle vibrated his chest where her cheek rested against it. "I was about to apologize to you. I gotta say, I never had sisters. I didn't know how scary PMS could be." "Where did you end up going?" "Greenville," she muttered. "But, that's almost an hour away. Newport would have been closer." She leaned back and gave him a watery smile. "No Starbucks. I had priorities." "Where's Alec?" "In his room." He lifted a finger to his lips and lowered his voice. "He's grumpy, too, which is nice to see for a change." "Are you hungry?" "I'm starving." "You cooked?" She lifted the lid on the stove and laughed. "Hot dogs and macaroni and cheese? And is that barbecue sauce?" "It is. Cowboy mac and cheese." "How could I resist, then? I do love cowboys." She looked at him from under her lashes. Brodie's breath caught in his throat. The way she was looking at him. And did she mean? He wanted to ask her, but Alec's door opened, and the boy slunk out. "I just wanted to make sure your hand was okay," he said awkwardly as Brodie dished up a plate for Emily. "It's just swollen and bruised a bit." Emily waggled her bandaged hand at him. "And I'm sorry about my behavior this morning." He shrugged. "It's okay, I guess. I wasn't sure if you were coming back." He said the words offhandedly, but from the way his shoulders were hunched up around his ears, Brodie figured it was an honest concern. "I'm sorry." Emily hurried over to put her arms around him. He stood stiffly, and she dropped a kiss on his messy auburn hair before she let him go. "I won't ever leave you." "Sure," he muttered. "I'm going to bed." After his bedroom door closed again, Emily gave Brodie a stricken look. "I didn't mean to scare him like that. I didn't even think about how Alec might react when I took off that way." They settled in their usual spots on the carpeted floor of the living room, Emily with her plate of food and Brodie with a soda. He wanted to tell her that Alec's feelings were totally normal, and it was encouraging that he was starting to engage with them, but he wanted more to get to the bottom of why she was really upset that morning. "He'll be okay," Brodie said. "So, tell me. Aside from..." Your thing that you already mentioned. Is anything else wrong? Please don't say you're regretting marrying me, he thought. Emily sighed. I'm sorry, she repeated. Like I said, the house, it's hard work. I know you have other things to do, and the house is my domain. We can't have horses bunking up here with us. I'm just worried I won't have it habitable by the time William gets here. Can I see if I can find some help for you? Brodie asked. You really shouldn't be doing all of that yourself, and I've got to start on the outside of the house tomorrow, fixing the porch and getting some windows replaced. She brightened for a moment at the idea of having someone to share the work, but her face fell almost as fast. We don't know anyone around here. And I don't want you to think that I'm not capable. I don't think that at all. You've done an amazing job so far. I'll call the minister from the church we went to yesterday. He gave me his card. Maybe he'll know of someone. Alec sat on his air mattress, thinking. He wanted to believe Aunt Emily when she promised she'd never leave, but his mom had always tried to reassure him things would be fine, too, and they never turned out that way. Brodie and Emily were talking now, too quietly for him to hear what they were saying, but he now knew they could start fighting again any time. He'd have to find some way to keep their attention off each other. And on him. Chapter 7. The next morning, the rain was gone, and the temperatures were promising to get hot and muggy fast. Emily didn't care, though. Brodie had come through for her, and Pastor Tom was sending someone over this morning who he promised would be a big help and could use the extra money. She still felt guilty that she wouldn't be able to finish everything herself, but Brodie didn't seem to mind. When an old Buick with a rattling muffler came up the drive, Emily was dressed and ready. Her thumb hurt less today, and she was eager to get back to work and make up for lost time. William had called and said he'd be delayed by 2 days, so, with help, she thought maybe they could pull it off. The driver's side door opened, and Emily laughed. It was the shy girl who had sat next to them at church. Hi, Becca. She waved and got a tentative smile in response. The passenger side door opened, too, and a boy about Alec's age got out. I hope you don't mind I brought my brother, Jacob, Becca said. I thought maybe your son would like someone to play with. Play with? The boy grinned. We're not 5, Becca. He brushed his blonde hair back with a definite swagger. Becca blushed. Kick it with, then? Jacob nodded approvingly. I see you've got the tween lingo down, Emily said, winking at Becca. I'm still working on it myself. Jacob, if you go up those stairs there, you'll find Alec in his room, probably reading. You can go on in. There's lemonade in the refrigerator. He headed off, tripping through the long grass as clumsily as a puppy. He's a cute kid. Thank you for bringing him. Alec will probably be excited to talk to someone his own age for a change. It was no problem. He begged to come along. This place is so beautiful, Becca told her, looking up at the house, her hands in the pockets of her well-worn overalls that Emily eyed as enviously as she would have eyed a pair of Prada heels a couple of months before. Overalls definitely made the statement, capable farm wife. Back when the Fergusons lived here, it was one of the nicest homes for miles. They just got too old to take care of it after their kids were all grown and gone. I'm so glad you all are restoring it. I'm just glad for your help, Emily said. You ready to get started? Sure, just let me get a few things. Becca started pulling things out of the back of her car. A picnic hamper, mops, buckets, and more, started piling up on the ground next to the car. You look like you're a pro at this. Emily grabbed as much as she could carry with one bum hand. Some of this cleaning stuff I don't even have. I do this for a living, Becca admitted, looking embarrassed. Nothing wrong with that, Emily replied cheerfully. I'm in dire need of professional help. Alec tried to ignore Jacob, but the guy made it impossible. Alec told him flat out that he wasn't looking to make friends, figuring the blunter he was, the quicker the other boy would get it, but Jacob was like Aunt Emily. Talkative and persuasive, he didn't give up pestering Alec the first day he was there until Alec finally agreed to show him around the farm. He didn't figure Jacob would come back, but sure enough, he was there again the next day. Finally, Alec gave in and the two headed off into the woods with some sandwiches and a thermos of lemonade. They found a good climbing tree, and over lunch, Jacob told him all about what it was like growing up in Tennessee. He then, of course, wanted to know what Alec's life had been like. Jacob even managed to tease out details that Alec hadn't shared with anybody. "So, I'm thinking to keep Aunt Emily and Brodie from fighting again, I should distract them." Jacob cocked his head and took another big bite of his PB&J. "What were you thinking of doing?" "I don't know," Alec admitted. "First, I decided to just be such a jerk, they had no choice but to deal with me instead of each other, but I'm not really good at that kind of stuff." "I could totally be a jerk." Jacob laughed. "But I don't think you're the type." "What about if you do the opposite?" "What do you mean?" "Well, instead of trying to make them mad at you, maybe try and make them like each other more." "Do they kiss and stuff?" "My oldest sister got married last year, and her husband kiss all the time. It's super gross. And my mom and dad are super old, and they even kiss." Alec was silent for a long moment, swinging his leg and thinking. "No, they don't really kiss. I mean, I only saw them do that once. Are they supposed to?" Jacob nodded wisely. "Yep. You gotta get them to kiss. They look at each other a lot." "Looks don't count." Jacob puckered his lips and made smacking sounds. "Parents are supposed to do that." "They're not my parents," Alec denied automatically. "And how am I supposed to get them to, you know?" Alec waved his hand vaguely, hoping his face wasn't red. "We'll figure something out." Jacob rolled up a piece of his crust and tossed it at Alec. "Trust me." Having someone to help made all the difference in the world. Emily couldn't believe how fast the time went. Once Becca opened up a little, she was smart and sweet and had a wicked sense of humor. They cranked up the radio, talked constantly over the music, and in a matter of 2 days, had the upstairs ready for habitation and developed a fast friendship. "We'll still be sleeping on air mattresses for a while," Emily said, admiring the way the wood floor in the master bedroom gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the window. "But at least we won't be sharing our house with any bugs." "Well, not after the window glass is replaced," Becca pointed out with a dimpling smile. "We should probably cover these with plastic in the meantime." Emma went to the window and stuck her head out where the glass should have been. Below, Brodie was working on the front porch. He'd demolished the rickety original structure the day before, and now, sweaty and stripped to the waist, Brodie was framing the new porch. Emily tried not to notice the way his muscles and his back and shoulders rippled when he swung a hammer, but it was hard not to. "Is it nice?" Becca asked a little wistfully. Emma ducked back guiltily. "Is what nice?" "Being married?" "So far, yeah. He drives me nuts sometimes, but overall, he's really sweet." She glanced back out the window, where her gorgeous husband was now tipping back a glass of iced tea. Emily wanted to fan herself. Brodie looked like the July picture on a hot Cowboys calendar. "We're still in the getting to know you stage." "We haven't." "Haven't what?" Becca's eyes were wide and curious. "And innocent." Emily herself was a virgin, but she felt downright knowledgeable looking at Becca's face. "We haven't fully gotten to know each other yet," she said instead. "How long did you date before you got married?" "That's just it. We didn't. We met at the altar," Emily said. "There's this matchmaking genius, her name is Dr. Lachele, and she set us up. We didn't meet until the day of the wedding." Becca's blue eyes got even wider. "You can do that? Weren't you scared you'd get stuck with someone you didn't like? Or someone that didn't like you?" "Kind of. But I needed a husband." She had already explained about Faith and Alec and suddenly becoming a mother. "Once I saw him, not just the way he looked, but the way he was, I just felt like everything could be all right. Now, I'm just trying to be the kind of wife he deserves." "A matchmaker, huh?" Becca whispered. Emily didn't hear her. She was thinking about the things she would need to do to become the wife Brodie needed. Learn to cook more than just boxed meals. Clean a house without being a total klutz and hating every second of it. Maybe learn to ride a horse. Definitely, she needed to learn how not to want to scream every time she thought about riding a horse. Her husband was a cowboy, for crying out loud. She needed to be a country girl. Brodie was tired, but it was a good kind of tired. His muscles ached, but it was from honest work, and he knew he'd sleep well that night. Plus, he was getting to use his carpentry skills from the first job he ever had, a contractor's assistant. He settled down in the shade and assessed his progress. The porch was starting to take shape, and he'd matched the dimensions to the original. With luck, provided his calculations were right, the new porch would be an exact replica of the old one. He could picture it clearly in his mind, sitting in a rocking chair on the screened-in veranda, a glass of iced tea in his hand and his beautiful wife across from him. His eyes went to the bedroom window on the second story, where he could see Emily talking to Becca. He grinned. He'd caught her earlier eyeing him, but only because he kept looking up there, hoping for a glimpse of her. He was glad she'd made a friend since that would give her one more anchor to Wolf Creek, Tennessee. Back in New York, she'd had a lot of friends. He was also glad that Emily's new friend had introduced Alec to her brother. Maybe, he thought wickedly, they could arrange a sleepover soon. Brodie was hoping that he and Emily could finally have a sleepover of their own. Later that evening during dinner, Brodie's phone rang. He spoke to someone briefly, and then hung up and whooped, making Alec jump. "All right, guys, the driver is almost here. Want to go see our horses?" They got to the pasture at the same time a truck and horse trailer were pulling in. In a few moments, Brodie was leading out a lovely all-black horse. Her coat gleamed in the setting sun, and she pranced nervously, tossing her long, crimped mane and rolling her eyes wildly. Emily cringed when the horse suddenly tried to rear, but Brodie just held her lead tightly and spoke calmly and quietly. Finally, the horse settled down, and Brodie led her to the barn. The next horse was even worse. It looked very much like the first horse, shiny and black, but it was even bigger. And it looked mean. Brodie had his hands full trying to control the animal, but again, he patiently waited it out until it was calm. Emily realized she'd been biting her knuckle. Some country girl she was going to make, she thought bitterly. It looked like her childhood fear hadn't gone away. She was still afraid of horses. Looking at Brodie, though, he was in his element. He came out of the barn, his smile wide. "Aren't they incredible?" he asked Emily, not waiting for a response. Instead, he picked her up and swung her in a circle, surprising a shriek of laughter out of her. "I've got a call rider. This is an incredible pair of horses, Tennessee walkers, too." He walked away, already taking out his phone to make the call and laughing at his friend's obvious joke. Emily cautiously approached the fence, where Alec already sat on the top rail, studying the new arrivals. "They're pretty, aren't they?" Alec asked her. Pretty terrifying, she thought silently to herself, but she had to admit, the horses were beautiful. "My mom liked horses," Alec said quietly. "She said the neighbor where she lived growing up had one." "That's right," Emily said to Alec. His name was Pepperpot. This was the first time Alec had opened up to her enough to talk about faith, and Emily was grateful to the big, mean horses for making it happen. "Do you like horses?" Alec asked, glancing at her. Sure," she said unconvincingly. "How could you not like an animal that pretty?" She looked out at the field, where the female horse was delicately lifting her tail to relieve herself. Alec snickered, and the next thing Emily knew, she and her nephew were laughing like lunatics. The next day was moving day. Becca came back to help, and between the two of them, she and Emily had everything moved over to the main house in just a short amount of time. Not that they had much. Just clothes, air mattresses, and sleeping bags. "Well, we're ready for William now," Emily said, dusting off her hands and looking around the shabby living room. "Living in the main house. For better or for worse. I guess you won't need me anymore, huh?" Becca looked around, too, but wistfully. "Actually," Emily said hesitantly, and Becca's face lit up. "Yeah? I need you to teach me some things." Becca looked baffled. "You went to college?" You lived in New York City, by yourself. You're just so competent. What could I possibly be able to teach you? Emma shook her head and wandered into the kitchen. You don't give yourself nearly enough credit. You know how to do things I would never in a million years be able to do. You can cook, clean, sew, can vegetables, grow food in a garden. I can get along okay in a big city, but out here, I'm useless. I want to learn to do all the things a country wife knows how to do. I want my husband to love me. The last sentence came out unintentionally, and Emily bit her lip. Becca said softly. You don't have to know how to do all of that to make Brodie love you. Have you seen how that man looks at you? Please, Becca. Teach me everything your grandma taught you. Becca sighed. Do you want to learn for you or Brodie? You can't make yourself miserable on account of someone else. I know you hate cleaning, and you said yourself you're not big on cooking. Maybe you're the kind of person that needs to have a job or a business around here? Emily wrenched open the antique refrigerator door to pull out a soda. She offered one to Becca, and they both sat down at the kitchen table. No offense, she said to her friend, who lived just across the French Broad River, but what kind of job could I get here in the back of beyond? What did you do in New York? Emily gave her a sheepish look and fiddled with her Coke can. Well, I was a yoga instructor. Becca shook her head. The Methodist Church on Main does yoga classes every Thursday, but I don't think there'd be a market for a yoga studio. People around here aren't really into that. Did you do anything else? Emily dropped her eyes. I was a dog walker. And a receptionist for an advertising agency. And I worked for a flower shop for a little while. After that, I took a couple of classes and worked as an assistant for an interior designer. I also did waitressing. Oh, and I was a nanny for a couple of months. I forget what else. Wow. You've done a lot of different things, huh? Becca quirked a little smile. The job market's not that big in Newport, but I hear the Tasty Time Deli is hiring. And now we're back to cooking, Emily replied with a laugh. Just teach me. Please? I'll keep paying you, and you can do your best to turn me into a passable housekeeper and cook. At the very least, I'll have someone to keep me company. And if it doesn't work out, well, I'll figure something else out, I guess. William arrived later that day, honking his horn merrily as he came up the drive in a big U-Haul truck, towing a vintage white Cadillac behind it. Alec ran to him, almost stumbling over a rock on the way. He was in such a hurry, and threw his arms around the elderly man in a hug. Brodie raised his eyebrows. Looked like the boy had formed an attachment with at least one person in his new life. Did I say thank you? Emily asked him, her eyes gleaming at the sight of her nephew so happy. Because I mean it. Thank you for bringing William here. He watched as she ran down the hill, almost as fast as Alec had. William grinned widely and hugged her as well. William, Brodie said, it's good to see you. How was your trip down? William shook his head, his eyes a little misty. It was like coming home. Thank you for offering to take me along with you. He smiled fondly at Emily. New York had gotten pretty boring already with you gone. And after working there for so many years, I hadn't realized how much I needed a change of scenery. Come see your apartment, William. Alec said, grabbing the man's hand. It's all cleaned up and ready to move in. That's something we need to talk about, William said. I'll need to know how much rent will be. There is no rent, Brodie replied firmly. Consider yourself retired and hang on to those social security checks of yours. Now, do you mind if we start unloading your stuff? Brodie asked. We can get you settled in no time, and then maybe the four of us can go get dinner in Newport. I'd like that. I'm not sure how much help I'll be. Don't worry about it, Emily assured him, already heading to the back of the U-Haul to open the doors. Your family now. We'll take care of it. William nodded and surreptitiously wiped at his eyes while Brodie pretended he didn't notice, then gave them another wide smile as he let Alec lead him away. It seemed like a weird idea at the time, Brodie said after they'd gotten out of hearing distance, but I think inviting that man down here was the right thing to do. Emily looked up at her husband, leaned onto her toes, and gave him a sweet, soft kiss. It absolutely was. Thank you. Chapter 8. Life settled into a routine, and if Emily didn't find it enjoyable yet, she was determined to learn. Becca was at the house nearly every day, giving Emily pointers on the fine art of keeping house. Usually, she brought Jacob with her, and the boys were inseparable, either scarfing down cookies together on the front lawn, their heads together as they schemed about 10-year-old boy stuff, or spending time with William in the apartment, where he regaled them with tales of his time in the army or his father's famous exploits. Brodie spent much of his time down at the barn with his horses or working on the outside of the house, clearing down the kudzu vines that had climbed the walls of the house or replacing windows brought in from town a few at a time. Emily worked. No, be sure to add the eggs one at a time. She glared down at the cookie dough in the big stoneware mixing bowl she held. Why, she challenged. Doesn't it all just get mixed up anyway? Becca shrugged and smiled. Honestly, I don't know, but you wanted me to teach you the same way Granny taught me, and she always insisted that the eggs be added one at a time. It doesn't matter, Emily grumbled. I'm just going to burn them like the last 2 batches. Come on now, Becca encouraged. You're doing fine. After we get the cookies in, I'll show you how to make a pot roast in the slow cooker. Men can't resist a good pot roast, she teased, and women can't resist a good crock pot. But that evening, despite Emily's best efforts, the pot roast had the leathery texture of an old shoe. Don't worry, Brodie soothed, the flavor's good. I'm sure this will all come to you with practice. William shrugged apologetically. Dentures, he said, pushing the roast beef to the side and focusing on his mushy carrots and potatoes. Alec didn't care. He wolfed the tough meat down at the same speed he ate everything else. William and Alec raved over the chocolate chip cookies she brought out for dessert, but that didn't make Emily feel any better. After the last batch she tried turned out so hard and dense, they were like little boulders, probably because she didn't add the eggs one at a time. Becca had taken pity on her and baked a batch up herself, magically turning out cookie perfection from the temperamental 75-year-old oven. They were just the right combination of chewy and crispy, and the flavors melted on the tongue. She felt like a fraud when Brodie complimented her lavishly and didn't want to tell him that she hadn't baked them at all and risk seeing his face fall in disappointment. Brodie insisted that she get off her feet after dinner, saying that he'd wash the dishes, and Alec would put them away. She sat on the horsehair sofa in the parlor, absently picking at a tear in the brocade upholstery. She wanted to give up. But that was the problem. She gave up on everything. All of the different jobs she'd hopscotched around to in New York. Emily was afraid she had a commitment problem. So, she decided to work twice as hard. Her biscuits were like bullets. Her fried chicken was undercooked on the inside and an unappealing shade of dark brown on the outside. Her custard pies were runny with doughy crusts. Even Becca's unfailing good cheer was starting to fail. Alec loved William's apartment. Unlike when he and Emily and Brodie had stayed there, William had furniture. His plaid easy chair was old, faded, and, somehow, matched the carpet perfectly. He had a couch, a big TV that he let Alec watch cartoons on, tons of books to read, and he always kept Cokes in the fridge, the ones in the glass bottles. Currently, they were working on a 1,000-piece puzzle, the pieces arranged on a card table within reach of William's easy chair. Grab me that corner, will you, son? Alec held out the piece. William, have you noticed that Emily's not happy? Well now, the old man said, pushing up his thick glasses as he leaned forward to fit the piece into place. I wouldn't say she's unhappy. She is, Alec insisted. Did you see her face this morning when she served us up those soggy waffles? William chuckled. Those waffles were a little on the squishy side. I think Emily's just trying hard to please us all. Jacob says she made Becca teach her how to cook, because the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. He made a face and snapped 2 more pieces of the puzzle together. Which I think sounds gross. But she's totally not going to be able to impress Brodie if she keeps burning everything or leaving it raw in the middle. Now, Don't worry about the grown-ups, William chided. You need to let them figure things out for themselves. I know, Alec sighed. Jacob says they should be kissing, though. His mom and dad and his sister who is married kiss all the time. If they're busy kissing, they won't get divorced. But how are they supposed to kiss with Brodie in the fields and Emily in the kitchen all the time? William gave the boy a long look. I can't argue with that logic, son. Tell you what. How would you like to spend the weekend with me? We can drive over to Pigeon Forge and hit some of the go-kart and mini-golf places, eat a bunch of pizza, and crash in a hotel for a couple of nights. Maybe then your aunt and Brodie can have some time together. Alec grinned. I like the way you think. Those are some beautiful horses. Just look at that filly. Those legs go on for miles, don't they? Brodie jumped a little. He'd been so busy staring off into space, mooning over Emily, that he hadn't heard the older man come up behind him. I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind me taking Alec with me for the weekend, William said, looking closely at Brodie. I've got an itch to drive over to Gatlinburg and Pigeon Forge area, play some arcade games like I used to when I was younger, maybe check out that Ripley's museum I read about, and I think it's time you spend some time with your own little filly instead of hiding out here in the barn. Brodie's heart immediately skittered at the thought of having Emily to himself for 2 uninterrupted days. He wanted to tell William to go ahead, take off now. Leaving Thursday was even better than leaving Friday, right? But instead, he flushed and laughed a little. I'm not hiding from anyone, especially Emily. Sure you are, son, William said wisely. She's practically bending over backwards to make you happy, but you can see that everything she's doing, it isn't working for her. And you're too afraid to tell her so. You all need to have a good, long talk, and maybe a little fight to get everything out in the open. And you don't need an old man and a little boy underfoot when you make up afterward. He winked. They decided to keep the weekend a surprise for Emily. Brodie called Becca ahead of time and told her what was going on, and Becca promised to stop over in the morning, very early, and leave a weekend's worth of food for them both in William's refrigerator. Brodie would get the morning chores done early, too, and then William and Alec would announce they were leaving. Brodie had a surprise delivery planned for around 10, and after that, it would just be the two of them. He couldn't wait. On Saturday morning, Emily frowned in concentration as she read the recipe from an old Fanny Farmer cookbook she found in the cupboard. Muffins. How difficult could blueberry muffins be? Jacob and Alec had brought her a whole basket full of blueberries they'd found, and she swore if she couldn't turn them into muffins, she was telling Brodie tonight, she would never set foot in their kitchen again. She blew a sweaty strand of hair out of her face after she put the muffins in the oven and looked around the kitchen. She'd been spending so much time in here lately that she'd sort of become used to the linoleum patches with plywood underneath and the dingy-looking, yellowed walls. With the 20 minutes she had until the timer dinged, she let herself imagine what the kitchen could look like. Embrace the vintage theme, she thought. Find new countertops that picked up the pink in the fridge. Maybe a kitschy black and white tile floor and some curtains with a retro flower pattern that echoed the green in the pink and green pattern of the 1940s enameled table that was starting to grow on her. Glass-fronted cabinets that still showed off the antique dish collection without looking like the cupboard doors had all fallen off, and from there, she could work her way into the living room and onto the rest of the house. Maybe that was it, she thought, excitement rising. She had loved the interior design job she'd had in New York, and she'd scored in the top 3% of the students in her interior design classes. She'd just disliked the boss that had constantly tried to hit on her the whole time she'd worked for him. Before she left, she'd given him such a blistering set down that he told her he'd blacklist her from every other decorator in town. She'd been so young and unsure, she'd just moved on to a different kind of work and taken him at his word. Now, she realized that his competitors probably wouldn't have cared less that she quit. The guy was a well-known womanizer. She could renovate and decorate the whole inside of this house and turn it into a resume for future jobs, take pictures of her work and design a website. She could take her fun and funky set of style that she used to apply to her clothes, before she'd bought overalls and black t-shirts, and apply that to design. Even if she had to travel a little, there still had to be other people in the area that needed interior facelifts for their homes. The timer dinged, effectively bursting her bubble. Interior decorating was probably just another big idea, like William always used to tease her about. Who was to say she could commit to that either? She was ready to give up after a week of cooking lessons. And renovating the house would be expensive. She and Brodie still hadn't talked about finances, and she felt guilty every time she bought something. Emily put on oven mitts and braced herself for disappointment as she pulled open the oven door. 24 perfect golden brown sugar-topped muffins waited inside. Hardly daring to breathe, in case they somehow collapsed, Emily carefully pulled out both trays and set them on the stove. The rich smell of caramelized brown sugar mingled with the underlying tang of blueberries, and she had to back away toward the kitchen table, afraid her legs wouldn't support her anymore. She sank down into a chair and whispered, "Thank God," before bursting into laughter. She had made muffins. There was hope, and suddenly her day was looking much better. The boys stared at the platter almost reverently. Alec had already been practically vibrating with excitement when he'd burst into the kitchen, but he had immediately slowed, sniffing the air cautiously. Brodie, too, had come in with a big, mischievous smile that hinted to Emily that something was up, but the sight of the gorgeous pile of bakery-worthy muffins stopped him cold. She'd dressed up the table a bit, pulling out cup crystal juice glasses for the OJ, and instead of the paper plates they usually used, she'd found delicate china with a pretty floral pattern and heavy silverware that wasn't too tarnished. William let out a low, appreciative whistle when he entered the dining room. "What's the celebration?" he asked cheerfully. "Have you all told her?" "Told me what?" Emily asked. "Never mind. Sit down first. I want everyone to taste these while they're still warm. You can tell me after that. You baked these?" Alec broke open a muffin, and fragrant steam rose. "With the blueberries we brought you yesterday?" "I sure did," Emily replied proudly and resisted adding "all by myself." She spread butter on her own muffin, glorying in the way that it melted into the still warm, fluffy insides. She watched William, Alec, and especially Brodie, afraid for a moment that she'd done something dumb, like adding salt instead of sugar, but from the expressions on their faces, she deemed it safe. After 2 bites, she stood up and did a happy dance to their applause. "Best muffins I ever had," Brodie said appreciatively after taking a drink of his orange juice. "And now, we have a surprise for you." To Emily's amazement, 5 minutes later, the big old house was empty, except for her. And her cowboy. An entire weekend, for just the 2 of them. Out the window went Emily's plans to clean the dingy-looking grout in the upstairs bathroom, and she breathed a sigh of relief. Brodie's blue eyes twinkled. "It's just you and me now." A shiver went through her. She knew what that meant. They were finally going to get around to being married. "Don't you have chores?" "In the barn?" Emily felt her cheeks heating as he took a step toward her, but the sound of a truck pulling up made him slap his forehead and stop. "I almost forgot. One more surprise." 2 men came tromping in through the kitchen, carrying a huge, plastic-wrapped box spring. It took some maneuvering and cursing, but they made it up the stairs to the master bedroom. Next came the mattress. Finally, packages of linens and comforters. Emily felt her cheeks getting redder with each trip. Did they guess? The delivery men couldn't have known, but she felt like her love life was on display. Finally, they were gone, taking the old, formerly chipmunk-inhabited mattresses with them. "No more air beds for us." Brodie grinned, sinking down on the bed, bouncing a little. "I've got a new one coming for Alec, too, on Monday, but I asked them to put a rush on this one." "Why, Mr. Callahan?" Emily asked teasingly. "Did you have something in mind for this bed?" It was beautiful. The big 4-poster looked much better once Emily and Becca had taken down the rotting canopy and cleaned the whole thing, rubbing the gorgeous, dark antique wood with beeswax until it gleamed. "Yep." He smiled, flopping backward. "A nice, long nap." He patted the bed beside him. "Care to join me, Mrs. Callahan?" "Don't mind if I do." She kicked off her shoes, sitting down on the edge next to him, butterflies flitting nervously in her belly. Leaning backward, she gave a huge sigh. Forget lovemaking, she thought dimly. The mattress had the perfect blend of softness and give, with a memory foam topper that put their former inflatable beds to shame. But when Brodie rolled over until he was looking down at her, one hand on each side of her, her breath caught. He leaned down and kissed her. Softly, searchingly at first, and then broke away. "Are you ready?" he asked. "Because if not, that's okay." She interrupted him by grabbing hold and pulling him down on top of her. No more words were needed. Emily was more than ready. "We didn't even put the sheets on," Emily giggled afterward, her head resting on Brodie's stomach. It shook beneath her as he laughed. "Maybe next time." Despite being exhausted and a little achy in some interesting places, Emily couldn't wait until next time. Her foster mother hadn't really explained the physical side of marriage, being a very prim and quiet woman, who would only say that behavior should be saved for marriage. Health class in school had given her the general idea of the mechanics, but the reality was far more fun. She traced light circles on Brodie's chest until he grabbed her hand. "Better not start, or we'll have to put those sheets on the bed now," his voice rumbled under her ear. Emily giggled and sat up. "Why don't I just take care of that now, then? Unless there's something else you'd rather be doing?" Brodie leaned forward and cupped her cheek. "There's nothing I'd rather be doing right now." And then he gently took her mouth in another kiss, sending tingles right down to her toes. Chapter 9. Thanks to Becca, Brodie and Emily didn't have to venture far to find dinner that evening when they finally emerged from the bedroom. A quick trip to William's apartment, and they were able to raid the fridge for a casserole that only required heating up. Brodie handled all the cooking and promised Emily a foot rub afterward. All that evening and the next day, except for when Brodie left briefly to check on the horses, he and Emily spent nearly every moment together. To Brodie, it was heaven. He felt like they'd finally connected, physically and emotionally. He wanted to tell Emily what he discovered, that he was head over heels in love with his matchmaker-chosen bride, but he was waiting for just the right time. Plus, he was a little afraid. He knew that some unhappiness had been nagging at her, and he wasn't convinced that a batch of beautifully baked muffins had solved the problem. He knew how many jobs she'd gone through in the past. What if she got frustrated with the position of wife, mother, and homemaker and, he felt terrible for even thinking it, decided to quit that, too? Emily was struggling with similar thoughts. She'd finally admitted to herself that there was only one cowboy, and one man, for her, but part of her still wondered if she'd be able to measure up to what a good country wife should be. Remembering her idea about becoming an interior decorator, she wondered, too, how she could make that happen. She still had no idea what it took, financially, to start a horse farm, and with all of the materials he'd been buying for the outside renovations they'd done so far, what if they couldn't afford to even fix up their own house, much less start another business? Maybe they'd be stuck sitting on ripped antique sofas until he sold his first colt, whenever that turned out to be. She decided she'd keep her interior decorating ideas to herself for now. She'd apparently mastered muffins, so from here, she'd just keep working with Becca, maybe starting with breakfast and working her way up to dinner. Then, Becca could start showing her how to do other things. Eventually, she'd put together a scrapbook of ideas, and when the time came and money allowed, she'd work on the house. For now, she just needed to focus on her housekeeping skills, as much as she hated the thought. Studying Brodie's face by the light of the candles she'd put out to make Saturday night's dinner more romantic, she loved the way his blue eyes were shadowed in the dim light, and the light stubble on his cheeks made her itch to run her fingers over it. Maybe she wasn't excited about the work ahead of her, but for Brodie, she felt like she was making the right decision. Brodie decided he'd let things lie one more night. Maybe they could drive to Greenville the next morning. Emily would probably like a mocha, and the guys weren't due back until mid-afternoon. Maybe they could even go out to lunch. Emily, too, seemed to be in a pensive mood, lost in her own thoughts across the table, so he tried to tease a smile out of her. He yawned and stretched, making a big show of checking the time on his watch. It was only 8 o'clock. "I'm going to go down and check on the horses one more time. Then, I was thinking about taking a bath in that gigantic clawfoot tub before I turn in. Going to bed early, huh? She smiled slowly. You must be worn out from all the relaxing we've done. He nodded sadly. Plum tuckered out for some reason. Hey, you wouldn't be interested in going to bed early after a bath in a gigantic clawfoot tub, would you? Emily frowned in mock thoughtfulness before she gave him a wicked grin. You know what, cowboy? I think I'd be very interested. Serious discussions could wait until tomorrow, she decided, running up the stairs to start the bathwater. For now, Emily just wanted to pretend the outside world didn't exist and enjoy this time with Brodie. You know, Emily said as they headed down the highway toward Greenville the next morning, the warm breeze from the half-open window teasing curls free from her ponytail, it's almost September. We're going to have to get Alec enrolled in school, get him school clothes, she stopped. Crud. She'd forgotten all about the money concerns she suspected. But Brodie didn't look bothered at the thought of expenses. You're right. He laughed. Being out here in the country air has made him grow faster, I swear. He's probably put on 2 or 3 inches since we came here. Brodie wanted to facepalm. The last thing he meant to do was remind Emily of the move from the city that she probably still regretted. But when he glanced at her, she didn't seem worried. So, hey, he started awkwardly. There's some stuff we should probably talk about. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. He didn't want their interlude to end, but it was probably past time they talked about more than Alec, or horses, or mundane day-to-day things. Suddenly, the most perfect idea came to him. He blurted it out before he thought it fully through, convinced that it would solve everything. I was thinking we should hire Becca on a full-time basis. That was not what Emily thought he was going to say. She paused for a moment, her plans scattered. Why? She asked slowly. You know, Brodie said. You like her cooking. That chicken she made for us that we ate last night was amazing. And those chocolate chip cookies? Just like my mom's. Wrong approach, he thought, taking his eyes off the road to gauge her reaction. Emily's eyes were narrowing, and he didn't think that was a good sign. He hurried to reassure her. The muffins you made for breakfast the other day were awesome, too. I'm sure Becca couldn't have done better. I was just thinking about, the attempts before that. You know I'm learning, right? But you had guessed Becca made the cookies even though I didn't correct you when you said I did. Emily kept her voice low, but suddenly she wanted to start screaming. Never mind that she didn't like cooking, she'd been trying, hadn't she? And here, the whole time she was trying to please Brodie, he was salivating over another woman's cooking. Oh, look. Brodie pointed. Starbucks, next exit. He hit the turn signal fast. It was a pathetic attempt at distraction. I don't want Starbucks anymore. How about you tell me more about how much you love Becca's cooking, Emily said sweetly. It's not that, Brodie replied quickly, feeling like he was suddenly in quicksand. His temper sparked. Why did women always think men meant the worst? You've been doing amazing, sweetie. I just thought maybe you'd want to try something different, so you don't get burned out on house stuff. We could have Becca do the cleaning, too, if she was up for it. Does Becca make the toilet shine brighter than I do? No. Thoroughly exasperated now, he searched frantically for the green and white sign that would indicate chocolate was imminent. Is this PMS again? Oh, that's just great. Enough was enough. She finally understood the expression, steam coming out of her ears. First, I'm a crappy cook. Second, I don't clean up to your high standards. Third, I'm incredibly irritated with my bonehead husband, and it mustn't be his fault. It has to be PMS just because I'm mad that my husband would prefer another woman's homemaking skills to mine. There it was. Starbucks. He pulled in quickly. The line looked about 3 miles long. I don't prefer her homemaking skills. He tried valiantly, one more time, to dig himself out of the hole that had opened under his feet. I just don't want you to get bored. You were always doing something different, job-wise, in New York, and here, You're just stuck on the farm, doing the same thing day after day and obviously not having the best time of it. I'm afraid, out with it, he decided. Honesty was the best policy, and he was already in deep enough. I'm afraid you'll get tired of living out here, or the work will be too hard, and you'll leave me. Us? Emily reared back as if Brodie had slapped her. Her argument was going to be that they couldn't afford to hire Becca full-time, but this? The fact that Brodie thought she was the kind of person that would just outright leave her husband and orphan nephew? I would never leave you both, she hissed, tears clogging her voice. And I don't know if I can ever forgive you for thinking I would. This is Jaden, came a bored-sounding voice, to Brodie's left. Welcome to Starbucks. What can we get for you? A rewind button? Brodie thought miserably. He'd love to go back and start this whole day over. Alec had a stomachache, but it was totally worth it. He and William had so much fun in Pigeon Forge. It was like Vegas. 4 kids, they'd played 3 miniature golf courses, gone to 2 different go-kart places, played a game of laser tag, spent a few hours at some corny-sounding but secretly very cool place called Dollywood, explored a weird museum that looked like an upside-down house, and eaten so much at an all-you-can-eat buffet that he had to lay outside the restaurant, spread-eagled on the grass, until he was sure he wasn't going to throw up in William's Cadillac. For an old guy, William sure knew how to have fun. William was pretty beat, though, and Alec, too, though he'd never admit it, so they decided to drive home a couple hours early. He couldn't wait to see if their plan worked, and Brodie and Aunt Emily were kissing when he got there. Surprisingly, they pulled up right before Emily and Brodie did. They all got out of their cars at the same time, and it took only seconds for Alec's stomachache to get worse. I'm going to get some cleaning done, if you haven't already called Becca, Aunt Emily said in a mean, loud voice, her face all red. Fine, Brodie shot back, I'll be in the barn, with the horses. At least there's one female there that won't completely flip out on me for no reason at all. And the 2 of them stalked in different directions, not even noticing that he and William were back. When Aunt Emily stomped past him, he saw there were tears on her cheeks. William sighed and laid a comforting hand on Alec's shoulder. I'm sorry, son. Sometimes married couples fight. We just gotta let them work things out on their own. You want to come up to my place and watch some baseball? I think the Giants are playing Detroit. No, thank you, Alec muttered. Thanks for taking me with you this weekend, though. It was really great while it lasted. He headed for the house. The attic was sounding good right about now. And maybe Bandit would keep him company while he thought about how he was going to put Plan B in motion. Emily fumed all the way up to the bedroom. But at the sight of the 4-poster bed where she and Brodie had spent so much time that weekend, her anger turned to tears. Instead of sitting down on it, she couldn't have stood that, she sank down on the floor and pulled out her cell phone. Who to call, though? It wasn't Becca's fault that Brodie preferred her cooking, but still, how could she call her friend in this case? She scrolled through her phone. Dr. Lachele. The image of the motherly woman with her purple hair popped into her head. The calm, rational matchmaker would certainly have some advice for her. She dialed the number, wiping her eyes with the hem of her t-shirt as the phone rang. Matchrimony, Lachele speaking. At the sound of her familiar, perky voice, Emily lost it again. Sobbing, she said brokenly, Dr. Lachele, this is Emily Murphy, Callahan. I think I've made a terrible mistake. Alec knew it wasn't right to eavesdrop, but as he fed Bandit a cracker, he couldn't help but hear Aunt Emily in her room, telling someone all about how it was a mistake to have gotten married. She was crying, and he tried to choke back his own tears. There it was. How could he have gotten so comfortable here, knowing that nothing was ever permanent? I'm going to do it, Alec said decisively. Bandit's bright eyes looked up at him, and her little nose twitched inquisitively. No more depending on other people. I'm going out on my own. He tiptoed down the attic stairs, careful of the 3rd step from the bottom, which squeaked loudly if you stepped on it in the right place. He sidled past the closed door to Emily and Brodie's room and quickly slipped into his own. A few minutes later, he had packed up a change of clothes, his sleeping bag, and a well-worn copy of one of his favorite books, about a boy who lived alone on his own mountain, along with a few other things, and then made his way down to the kitchen. It might have been a better idea to wait until nighttime fully fell, he thought nervously, peeking out the window to see if Brodie or William were around, but he couldn't. He had to go now. Stuffing as many shelf-stable foods as he could find into his bag, he heard a scratching sound behind him and whirled around, expecting to see his aunt in the doorway. Instead, Bandit had crept up behind him, her claws clicking on the floor, probably wanting more crackers. He whispered, "Not now," and finished loading the bag with bottles of water. Then, he was out the door and walking toward the woods, oh so casually, in case anyone saw him. He was mad at Brodie and Aunt Emily, but he wished he could have told William goodbye. But it was too late. 5 minutes later, he couldn't even see the house anymore, through the thick trees. Alec was on his own. "You know men can be dummies sometimes," Lachele said in a soothing voice, "but we women aren't always so bright either." "That's true, wait, what?" Emily thought she'd heard wrong. Lachele laughed, the sound tinkling over the scratchy cell phone connection. "Hon, if my man offered me a full-time housekeeper, especially someone I already knew and liked, I'd be all over that idea, before he changed his mind." "But..." Lachele kept talking. "Do you like to cook?" "No, but..." "Does cleaning floors make your heart go pity-pat?" "No." "Then what's the problem?" "Your pride?" "Girlfriend, if there's something else you really want to be doing with your life, you need to talk to Brodie about it." Emily explained her interior decorating idea, and she could hear Dr. Lachele clapping on her side of the line. "That's perfect," she crowed. "Not only will you be doing something you love, but you'll be contributing to the family income. That's important to an independent woman like you." "But what if we can't afford it?" "Sweetie, you're asking the wrong person. You need to get off this phone and go talk to your husband. Sit him down and hash things out. It's not just the two of you that are affected when you fight, you know. Many newlyweds have the luxury of scrapping together with only themselves to worry about. You two have that handsome boy of yours." After Emily said her goodbyes and hung up, guilt was eating her up. She pictured Alec's face when they'd pulled up behind him and William. How it had gone from complete joy to fear in a split second. She and Brodie had been selfish. It was time to figure things out and then make it up to Alec. Chapter 10. Brodie Callahan. "Come out here." Brodie winced and wished he could crawl into a pile of hay. He'd made such a mess of things, and now, his wife, who he had hoped to avoid for the rest of the day, was outside the barn hollering for him before he'd even had a chance to figure out how to fix everything. Not that this was all his fault. Not by a long shot. He narrowed his eyes and leaned back against the stall door behind him. If she wanted to fight, she could come to him. Sure enough, after yelling twice more without managing to make her husband appear, Emily had to get over her anxiety and go in the barn, where the horses were. Sucking in a breath, she stepped into the shadowy interior of the building, where the not unpleasant smell of horse and straw surrounded her. Her eyes were still adjusting to the dim light when she heard a snuffling sound and almost screamed. "Brodie?" She tried to keep it steady, but her voice still shook. "Right here, darlin'," came his voice just ahead. Brodie didn't sound affectionate. He sounded grumpy enough to be ready for another round. Well, Emily could help him out with that. To her left, suddenly a huge black shape materialized, close enough that she could see the whites of its eyes and the huge yellowed teeth it showed, just before it whinnied piercingly. Instead of screaming, Emily crumpled to the ground in a dead faint. Brodie saw Emily coming, her lush curves and curly hair illuminated by the afternoon sunlight. She looked almost nervous, he thought, losing some of his irritation to curiosity. When Bella, the mare, popped her head over the stall in her usual friendly way to greet their visitor, Emily simply fell. Without sparing another thought for their argument, he ran to his wife, who was so pale, a few freckles stood out on her pert nose that he'd never even noticed before. He scooped her up in his arms and took her back out into the sunshine and fresh air. "Sweetheart," he said roughly, setting her down, "come on. Wake up." He rubbed her chilled hands and, in a moment, her eyes popped open. "Did it bite me?" she gasped immediately, trying to sit up. "No, Bella didn't bite you. Calm down," he said softly, rubbing her arms to try and calm her panic. "Why didn't you tell me you were afraid of horses?" Emily shuddered and glared at him like he had asked a dumb question. "Country wives are supposed to love horses." "Not if they're scared to death of them," Brodie retorted. Then, the light bulb finally went on. He sank down cross-legged in the deep grass beside her. "There's a lot of other things that country wives are supposed to like, too, aren't there? Things like cooking and cleaning up after a few sloppy guys?" Emily looked back at him challengingly. "Okay, so I'm not the typical farmer's wife. Is that any reason to suggest that I would leave my family? Or to hire a full-time housekeeper when we can't afford it?" "We can't afford it?" Brodie asked, genuinely puzzled. "And no, I don't believe you would leave us." "I'm sorry that I ever said that. It's just so frustrating, trying to figure out what you really want when you won't tell me. All I want is for you to be as happy as I am in this marriage." Emily plucked a long blade of grass and stared at it, spinning it between her fingers. "I guess that when you said that, it hit me in a sore spot. I've never been able to see anything through, but I've also never done anything as important as becoming a wife and mom. I could never leave you or Alec. I love you both too much." Brodie couldn't stand it anymore. She looked so sad, and his heart was definitely not in the fight anymore. He pulled her into his arms and hugged her, running a big hand down her back. "I love you, too," he murmured into her springy red curls. "I think I've loved you since the moment I saw you at the church." "How did we get so off track?" she whispered into his shirt. "Maybe by being busier trying to build a life than we were building a functioning marriage?" He grinned to take any sting out of the words. "And, for the record, we're not poor by any standards." "What do you mean?" She leaned back to look up at him warily. "Darlin', I'm not just good with horses. I'm good with investments. I saved just about every penny I made for 10 years, and in my downtime, instead of going to the bars in Deadwood with the other ranch hands, I booted up my old laptop and played the stock market. Even after paying for this place and all the repairs so far, I figure we've got about 5 million or so left." Emily looked so cute with her mouth hanging open that Brodie just had to laugh, closing it with a kiss. "Hey!" William's voice, sounding urgent, interrupted them. He was heading down the driveway toward them at a pace much faster than his usual hitching gait. "Either of you seen Alec anywhere?" Emily pulled back from Brodie's embrace and jumped to her feet. "He's not in the house?" "His door was closed. I thought he was in his room." William reached them, out of breath, and gave the Emily and Brodie a shaming look. "The boy did go to the house, all upset when you two came home fighting like a pair of cats. I just went there to check on him, but he's gone. Alec heard Brodie calling for him an hour or two before, but he didn't answer. He just kept climbing farther into the mountain, figuring he needed to put some distance between him and Brodie and Aunt Emily before he tried to find a place to set up camp for the night." Part of him wanted to answer Brodie, just give up and go back, no matter what happened, but he didn't want to spend every day wondering if that would be the one that saw his current family fall apart. So, he kept climbing. He slipped at one point, crossing a stream, and his feet got wet, which made walking uncomfortable. Alec wished he had grabbed another pair of shoes. And the woods were getting more shadowy with each passing hour. He couldn't even see how high the sun was in the sky because the canopy of trees was so thick, and the sky had gotten gray above them. He'd forgotten his watch, so he couldn't tell if it was because night was coming or if it was going to rain. Finally, he decided that it was going to be too dark to see if he went on much longer and found a small clearing that looked good enough to stay in for the night. In the book he'd read, the boy had used a flint and steel to start his fire, but Alec only had a box of matches. He gave up after using half of them, deciding that it was a good thing the wet kindling wouldn't light. He didn't want to be found if the fire gave him away. He pulled out his sleeping bag and set it up next to a fallen log, so he'd have something at his back at least, but the moisture from the ground soon soaked into the bag, making it feel damp and uncomfortable. Pine boughs for a bed next time, he remembered. He lay in the bag anyway as it got darker and darker around him, and a rustling sound gave him the shivers before he realized it was just rain. Rain that soon picked up speed with a grumble of distant thunder. Why couldn't he have found a handy hollowed-out tree or something? Hours later, it was fully dark, and Alec couldn't sleep. Rain dripped off his cold nose. He kept hearing noises and thinking about Aunt Emily's not-so-secret fears of bears in the woods. Those fears didn't seem so silly now. Something made a loud noise in the underbrush nearby, and Alec froze, too afraid to cry out. If it was a bear, he was going to get eaten. He didn't have anything to fight it off with. He pulled his small penlight out of his shirt, where he'd put it in hopes of saving the battery and keeping it dry, and held it in front of his face with a shaking hand. Rustling noises came closer, and his only hope was to blind whatever it was that was coming up to him. At the last second, he turned on the light. The thin, wavering beam revealed a pair of shining eyes and a small hunched shape that had him sucking in his breath to scream. But a familiar chittering noise stopped him, and he let out his breath in a gasping laugh. It was Bandit. Emily had never been so scared in her life. She sat with Becca in the kitchen, clutching a cup of coffee to warm her hands. She couldn't drink it. She'd already had countless cups. Outside, lightning flashed starkly, followed only a second later by a crash of thunder. Alec was out in that. And so was Brodie. Becca's face was drawn with worry, but she tried to sound reassuring. He'll be fine. My brothers know these mountains like the back of their hands. They've been running around in all the nooks and hollows since they were younger than Alec. It's after 2 in the morning, Emily said bleakly. It's been storming for hours. Alec's probably so miserable right now. That'll teach him not to do it again, William said brusquely from the doorway of the dining room. He'd said he was going to nap in the parlor until they heard something, but he hadn't been able to sleep yet. He kept popping back into the kitchen restlessly. William's words were tough, but his face was etched with strain. He gave a half-smile. They'll be pulling up on those noisy four-wheelers any time now, and you mark my words, this will all be just an exciting adventure to share with his new friends at school in a few weeks. As if his words were prophetic, the three of them heard a roar of engines in the distance that slowly grew louder. Emily threw open the kitchen doors to the wind and rain and saw headlights cutting through the fog. The 2 four-wheelers pulled up, and Emily made out 4 figures, shrouded in rain slickers. One of the figures was short and slim. Heedless of her bare feet, she ran out into the rain and pulled Alec into her arms. She pushed back his slicker and glared into his pale face. Alec Christopher Murphy, I don't care if you don't like hugs. She proceeded to wrap him so tightly in her arms, so tightly, Alec thought she'd never let go. He let the tears fall, finally, hoping she wouldn't. After Becca's brothers, grinning bearded twins in their late 30s, were plied with hot coffee and thanked profusely, the 3 of them left. Becca promised to swing by late in the morning to check on them and said she'd bring coffee cake. William just shook one gnarled finger in Alec's face and grabbed him tight in a one-armed hug. We're going to talk about the proper things you need to take with you next time you plan on living in the woods, you little city slicker, he warned before heading back to his apartment. Dressed in warm pajamas, clutching a mug of hot cocoa, Alec was left with Brodie and Aunt Emily. He looked up at them nervously. Don't ever do that again, you hear me? Brodie said roughly, his hair still wet from the rain and sticking up in spikes in some places. Do you know what could have happened to you out there? Alec flinched at the tone and ducked his head. He jumped when big, strong arms came around him and held him tight. Peeking up at Brodie, he was surprised to see tears in the man's eyes. In his experience, men never cried, and he felt his own throat tightening. To keep Brodie from seeing him lose it, Alec pushed his face into his flannel shirt. Smaller arms came around both of them, and he heard his Aunt Emily crying, too. Alec, she said thickly, tightening her hold, no matter how Brodie and I fight, we will never leave you, never stop loving you, and never stop loving one another. This family is going to stick. Ditto, rumbled Brodie. Alec felt something that had been like a tight knot loosen in his chest. He believed them. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was home. Brodie, I'm home. Alec raced into the house, dropping his backpack on the floor and grabbing a cookie out of the flowery antique jar on the counter. He squinted at it for a sec. Not too hard or black on the bottom. Looked like one of Becca's. Biting into it, he ran through the frou-frou dining room and parlor and thudded up the stairs. Brodie and Emily's bedroom door flew open, and his aunt was standing there, her hair kind of messy and her cheeks all red. "Hey, kiddo. Your uncle and I were just hanging up new curtains in here." Brodie stuck his head out in the hallway and winked. "No, we weren't," he told Alec confidentially. "We were kissing." "Gross," Alec yelled over his shoulder, heading for his space in the attic. It had been 2.5 months now, and he still checked every day for Bandit. He hoped she'd find her way back from the woods, but so far, the attic space was empty except for him and some dusty old trunks. Crumbling the last bite of the cookie on the floor, he whistled softly. "Come here, Bandit." He sat there quietly for a few minutes and was getting ready to go back downstairs when he heard a chittering noise. "Bandit," he said again, but the raccoon didn't appear. He went searching for her and finally found her, nesting between 2 rafters in the corner of the far end of the long room. Downstairs, Emily shook her head at Brodie. "Why do you always tell him we're kissing?" she asked in exasperation. "You know exactly why. William told me that Jacob says that married couples are supposed to kiss." He punctuated the statement with a wicked sparkle in his electric blue eyes and nibbled to the side of her neck, bared by the low ponytail she wore. "And we'd hate for Alec to think we're not happily married." "Well, I said you were helping me hang curtains, so don't you think you should put that new curtain rod up so you don't make a liar out of me?" Emily said, her hands on her hips. "You've been avoiding these curtain rods for the last 3 days, and your honey-do list isn't getting any shorter," she added teasingly. "You got it, darlin'. Not my fault you distract me so easily." He winked at her and picked up a bracket, lining it up next to the window. "What do you think he does up there every day?" Emily asked. "I didn't want to pry, and he never says." "Probably just kid stuff," Brodie said. "I always liked hanging out in my grandparents' attic as a kid. Pretended it was a pirate lair. But if you want to know, go ask him." Emily stood at the bottom of the steep little staircase. "Alec?" He didn't answer, so she headed for the top of the steps. The windows at each end were propped open, letting the crisp fall breeze circulate through the attic. She saw Alec crouched down at the far end. He looked up and quickly put his finger to his lips. She walked cautiously closer, hoping that he hadn't befriended a spider, or worse, chipmunks. Instead, a small raccoon lay curled up in a pile of old bedding, with 3 little kits nestled up at her belly. She didn't look aggressive, but Emily automatically put her hand on Alec's shoulder to pull him away. "Don't touch it," she whispered urgently. "That thing might bite you." "No, she won't," he whispered back, smiling happily. "This is my friend, Bandit." Then his face fell. "You're not going to make me get rid of her, are you?" "She's been my friend since we moved here." Emily caught a sudden glimpse of the future. Her almost 11-year-old dragging every stray animal home that he could find. Dogs, rabbits, cats, lizards, and who knew what else. But she put her hand on her own belly, looking down at the contented animal snuggling her babies. She wasn't about to put a new mother out on the streets. "Go ask your Uncle Brodie," she said instead, knowing that her husband would agree but would likely relocate the litter out to a warm spot in the barn. Alec dropped a little pile of crumbs within reach of the raccoon and slowly scooched away. "I'll ask Uncle Brodie before I go to William's. He's teaching me parcheesi this afternoon." "Actually, I was going to ask you something, too," Alec added, still watching Bandit and her babies. "Is it cool if I just call you, like, Ma and Dad? It's a lot easier than saying Aunt Emily and Uncle Brodie. And I don't know if you like Ma, but I already had a mom." He trailed off and glanced up at her worriedly. Emily smiled at him and reached out to mess up his reddish-brown hair, her heart completely full. "Ma sounds like the perfect name for a country wife," she said softly. Alec, grinning, headed full tilt toward the stairs, and Emily shook her head and called after him, "And tell William no poker."